Section 1. The moment it all started. There is a specific feeling that comes with watching The Simpsons late at night. The colors are warm. The music is familiar in the way that only something you've heard 1,000 times can be familiar, not because it's simple, but because it's been threaded into the fabric of your memory so deeply that hearing the first few notes feels less like listening to a song and more like arriving somewhere you've been before. Springfield glows in that particular amber television light. Homer is on the couch. Marge is in the kitchen. Bart is somewhere he shouldn't be. Lisa is playing her saxophone in her room, and Maggie is sitting quietly, watching everything with those enormous eyes that see more than anyone gives her credit for. And for a few minutes, or maybe a few hours if you're lucky, the world outside goes quiet. That's what this is. A long, slow journey through one of the strangest, most ambitious, most surprisingly dark pieces of American culture ever produced. A show that began as a scraggly cartoon on the margins of primetime television and somehow became the longest-running scripted series in the history of the medium. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. Decades of Sunday nights that began the same way and ended the same way and somehow never felt exactly the same twice. But underneath all of that warmth, underneath the couch gag and the chalkboard and Maggie being scanned at the grocery store checkout, there was always something else. Something that the writers understood about their own show from the very beginning. The Simpsons was never really a safe program. It was dressed up to look like one, the nuclear family, the suburban house, the friendly town, but from its earliest episodes, the people making this show were pushing at things that television wasn't supposed to push at. They were going places that animated programs had never gone. And sometimes they went too far. Not too far in the sense that they failed. Too far in the sense that they crossed lines that other shows wouldn't even approach, and then they kept going. They did it on purpose. They did it with craft and intelligence, and occasionally with a kind of gleeful recklessness that made network executives reach for antacids and parent groups reach for letterhead. They made episodes that got congressional attention. They made jokes that foreign governments formally complained about. They killed characters that audiences loved. They satirized institutions so precisely that those institutions felt genuinely threatened. They depicted things: addiction, grief, violence, abuse, the slow collapse of the American dream with an honesty that animated television simply was not supposed to possess. And they did all of this while also being, most of the time, very funny. That combination, the comedy and the darkness living inside the same 30-minute episode, is what makes The Simpsons unlike anything else. Most shows choose one or the other. The Simpsons chose both, and then spent 36 years figuring out what that choice actually meant. Tonight, we're going to follow that thread. We're going to move through the history of this show the way you might drift through a familiar neighborhood at night slowly, noticing things you usually walk past, pausing at the houses that have stories you never quite heard in full. Each section of this journey covers a different way that The Simpsons went too far. A different category of moment where the writers, directors, actors, and artists behind this show decided to push past what was comfortable, what was safe, what was expected of a cartoon that aired on Fox on Sunday nights. Some of these moments made the show better. Some of them caused genuine controversy that lasted years. Some of them were mistakes that the people involved have spent decades trying to explain. And some of them were so precisely, uncomfortably right that they've never quite been resolved. They just sit there in the archive of 800 episodes, quietly radiating the particular energy of something that told the truth when it wasn't supposed to. So find a comfortable position, let the room get dark, and let's begin at the beginning, which is to say, let's begin before the beginning, because the story of how The Simpsons first went too far starts before the show itself even existed as a show. In 1987, Matt Groening was sitting in the waiting room outside the office of James L. Brooks, a Hollywood producer who had won Academy Awards for Terms of Endearment and would later win more for As Good as It Gets. Brooks was developing a series of animated shorts for The Tracy Ullman Show, a sketch comedy program on the fledgling Fox network, and he had approached Groening about adapting his alternative comic strip Life in Hell, a bleak, funny, deeply personal comic featuring rabbits dealing with existential dread and the miseries of adult life into brief animated segments. Groening sat in the waiting room and thought about this offer. Life in Hell was his. Every character in it was his. If he signed over the rights, he would lose control of something he had built from the ground up. So in the time it took Brooks's assistant to come and collect him, Groening invented an entirely new family. He named them after his own family members. His parents were Homer and Marge, his sisters were Lisa and Maggie, and he gave the son, the troublemaker, the boy who would become the defining cultural icon of his era, the name Bart, an anagram of the word brat. The pitch worked. The shorts aired on The Tracy Ullman Show beginning in April 1987, and they were rough. The animation was crude, the voices were still finding themselves, the characters moved with the slightly unsettling quality of something not quite finished, but they were also unmistakably strange in a way that felt new. Even in those early 2-minute segments, there was something about the Simpson family that felt different from the animated families that had come before them. The Flintstones were a prehistoric sitcom. The Jetsons were a futuristic sitcom. Both of them were essentially live-action comedy structures dressed in animated clothing. The Simpsons, even in embryonic form, felt like something that was using the specific possibilities of animation to say things that live action couldn't quite say, things that were funnier, darker, more uncomfortable, and more honest than what a camera pointed at real actors could achieve. When the show was picked up for its own series on Fox and debuted on the 17th of December 1989 with an episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, it arrived at a moment when American television was hungry for something it couldn't quite name. The networks had dominated the landscape for decades. Cable was growing but hadn't yet found its voice. Fox was the scrappy fourth network, the one without the legacy programming or the affiliate coverage or the audience certainty of NBC, ABC, and CBS. Fox needed something that would define it. Something that would attract the viewers the big networks weren't chasing. Something that would signal to the culture that a new option existed. The Simpsons was that thing, and almost immediately, it began going too far. The first real controversy arrived in the show's first season. Not a massive controversy, not the kind that would generate congressional hearings or news magazine cover stories, but a genuine, felt resistance from a specific segment of American culture that would become very familiar to the show's producers over the following 3 decades. The protest came from educators and parents who had noticed something about Bart Simpson that troubled them deeply. Bart was cool. Bart was the kid on the show that children actually wanted to be. He had the skateboard and the attitude and the catchphrases, "Don't have a cow," "Man," and "Eat my shorts," and "Cowabunga." And he was funny in the way that kids who don't follow rules are funny when you're watching them from a safe distance. He was the class troublemaker turned into a pop culture hero, and he was everywhere by 1990. T-shirts, backpacks, lunchboxes, everything. And schools started banning him. Multiple school districts across the United States prohibited Bart Simpson T-shirts and merchandise on the grounds that they promoted disrespect for authority, glorified underachievement, and presented a model of childhood behavior that was antithetical to educational values. The principal of an elementary school in Los Angeles sent home a letter warning parents that their children were being exposed to a character whose example was harmful to academic environments. A school in Ohio went further and banned Simpsons merchandise outright, explaining that Bart's attitude toward teachers and adults sent the wrong message to impressionable young viewers. The writers of The Simpsons found this deeply amusing, and almost immediately found a way to make it worse. The episode Bart Gets an F, which aired in the second season, took the controversy head-on. Bart is failing school. He's facing the possibility of being held back a year. He tries, genuinely tries. The episode is surprisingly earnest about this, and he still fails his history test. He breaks down in tears. It's one of the most unexpectedly moving scenes in the show's early run. This cartoon troublemaker sitting in a classroom after everyone else has left, crying because he tried his hardest and it still wasn't enough. It earned a perfect score from Bart and a single extra point that saves him from repeating the 4th grade. But the episode doesn't end with triumph. It ends with something quieter and more honest. Bart is still Bart. He hasn't been reformed. He hasn't learned a lesson that transforms him into a model student. He's just a kid who had a hard week and got slightly lucky. And tomorrow, he'll probably do something he shouldn't. That episode, Bart Gets an F, was the most watched episode in the show's history at the time it aired, and remained the single highest-rated episode of The Simpsons for years. 14% of all American television households watched it the night it broadcast. Schools were trying to ban Bart Simpson from their hallways, and America was watching his story about academic failure in the largest numbers the show had ever seen. The tension between what authority figures wanted The Simpsons to be and what audiences actually responded to was established that early, and it never really went away. But the first time The Simpsons truly went too far, the first time the show did something that caused a genuine, lasting, complicated controversy that went beyond school dress codes and into questions about what art was allowed to do with real people, that came in the third season, in the summer of 1991, before an episode even aired. The episode was called Stark Raving Dad, and it featured Homer being committed to a mental institution after wearing a white shirt to work, which a Burns-administered psychological evaluation interprets as a sign of dangerous nonconformity. While in the institution, Homer meets a large, gentle, white man who claims to be Michael Jackson. And the voice of that character speaking, talking, doing everything except singing the songs that appear later in the episode was provided by Michael Jackson himself. Except it wasn't, officially. It was credited to John J. Smith, a pseudonym. Michael Jackson, at the absolute peak of his global fame in 1991, provided the voice for a character in The Simpsons, and then asked not to be credited because he wanted to see if the audience and the media would notice on their own, without the announcement, and because he thought it would be funnier that way. The producers agreed. The episode aired. And it became one of the most watched and most talked about episodes in the show's history, partly because of its quality, partly because of the obvious and immediately recognized voice of the most famous pop star on Earth coming out of a cartoon patient in a mental institution. The controversy when it arrived came from multiple directions at once. Some of it was about Michael Jackson himself, his relationship with the show, whether his participation constituted an endorsement, what it meant that he had chosen to appear in a cartoon under a false name. Some of it was about the episode's content, which included a character claiming to be a famous person who was not that famous person, which raised questions about how the show was using real celebrities, even when the real celebrities had chosen to participate voluntarily. But the deepest controversy was quieter and took longer to arrive. The episode features a song written for Lisa's birthday, a sweet, simple, lovely song called Happy Birthday, Lisa, which the Michael Jackson character and Bart performed together. The episode had originally included another song, a romantic ballad supposedly written by the Jackson character about a girl named Susie. The producers received complaints during production about a grown man writing a love song about a young girl, even in a cartoon context, and the song was pulled and replaced with the birthday song. The decision to remove it was made quietly. Almost nobody knew about it at the time. Decades later, following the release of the documentary Leaving Neverland in 2019, the episode became the subject of a different and far more serious conversation. The show's producers announced that Stark Raving Dad would be pulled from rotation, removed from streaming services, and essentially retired not because of what was in the episode, but because of what had been revealed about Michael Jackson in the intervening years, and because they felt they could no longer in good conscience continue to air an episode that featured his voice and presented him, however obliquely, in a warm and positive light. "I'm against it," Al Jean told the Wall Street Journal in 2019, referring to the episode. "I think in the current world it feels like the boys are on the show because he's Michael Jackson. And there's no way to say this isn't there for his benefit. It was, by any measure, a significant decision. The Simpsons had never before permanently retired an episode from its archive. Stark Raving Dad was gone. And the reason it was gone had nothing to do with anything the show had done wrong in 1991. It had to do with history arriving late, with context changing around a piece of art that couldn't change with it, with the particular helplessness of a creative work that exists permanently in the past, being judged by a present it couldn't have anticipated. That tension between what a show meant when it was made and what it means when the world has shifted around, it would follow The Simpsons for the rest of its run. The show that was always willing to go too far would eventually have to reckon with what that willingness had cost and what it had gotten wrong along the way. But in 1991, it was still very much figuring out where the lines were and whether it was more interested in finding them or crossing them. The answer, as the next 30 years would demonstrate, was both. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that this is being watched from hundreds of different places at hundreds of different hours. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. It helps more than you might think. And there is a lot more of this kind of journey where this came from. Section 2. The episodes that broke parents' groups. There is an organization called the Parents Television Council, and for approximately a decade, beginning in the mid-1990s, it had a complicated and mutually beneficial relationship with The Simpsons that neither side would ever quite acknowledge as such. The PTC, as it was known, was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III, a conservative media critic and activist who had spent years writing columns and appearing on television to warn American parents about the degrading influence of primetime entertainment on their children. Bozell was articulate, well-connected, and genuinely alarmed or genuinely performed alarm, depending on your perspective about the direction American television was heading in the era after the broadcast standards of the 1950s and 1960s had been largely dismantled. He had watched shows like NYPD Blue push the boundaries of nudity and language on broadcast television and decided that someone needed to be keeping score. The PTC kept score. It monitored hours of primetime programming, documented instances of what it considered inappropriate content, published reports with names like The Sewer Mentality and Family Hour Foul Up, filed complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, organized letter-writing campaigns as advertisers, and generally made the lives of network programming executives more complicated and more expensive. In its most active years, the organization generated more FCC complaints than any other group in the country at one point, accounting for the vast majority of all indecency complaints the commission received, a figure that later became controversial when it emerged that most of the complaints were form letters generated by automated systems rather than individual citizen grievances. The Simpsons was a recurring target, and here is the complicated part. Being a target of the PTC was, for The Simpsons, roughly equivalent to receiving a very loud endorsement from the people your audience already didn't trust. The show's viewership in the 1990s skewed young teens and young adults who had grown up with Bart and were now in their early 20s, watching the show with the specific appreciation of people who understood that the outrage it generated was part of its meaning. When the PTC complained about The Simpsons, it was essentially telling that audience that the show was doing something that made the right people uncomfortable, and the right people being uncomfortable was exactly what the audience wanted. This dynamic was not unique to The Simpsons. It was the same dynamic that had driven Elvis's hip swivel and rock and roll, and every other piece of youth culture that found its energy partly in the disapproval of authority. But The Simpsons was unusual because the controversy wasn't really about sex or drugs or the surface-level provocations that had always drawn parental disapproval. The Simpsons was controversial because it was politically pointed, satirically aggressive, and profoundly skeptical of institutions, including the institution of the family itself, in a way that went deeper than anything else on primetime television. The Itchy and Scratchy show provides the clearest window into this dynamic, because Itchy and Scratchy was The Simpsons commenting on its own controversy while simultaneously generating more of it. For those who need a reminder, Itchy and Scratchy is the cartoon within the cartoon, the show that Bart and Lisa watch on television inside Springfield. It features a mouse named Itchy and a cat named Scratchy, and their relationship is defined entirely by Itchy inflicting catastrophic, elaborately depicted violence on Scratchy in every single episode, while Scratchy suffers and dies in ways that escalate from episode to episode with a kind of Baroque inventiveness that the writers clearly enjoyed constructing. The violence in Itchy and Scratchy is extreme. Eyes are gouged, brains are extracted, characters are sawed, chopped, melted, incinerated, and dismembered, with a cheerfulness that the show frames entirely as parody. It's a joke about violent cartoons, a satire of Tom and Jerry, and the long tradition of animated mayhem that American children had been watching since the 1940s. The joke is that the violence is so excessive, so obviously beyond anything that could be taken seriously, that it reveals something absurd about all cartoon violence, including the sanitized, consequence-free version that had existed in children's programming forever. The PTC and groups like it did not find this funny. In the Season 5 episode Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, the show staged its most direct confrontation with this entire debate. Marge, after witnessing Maggie knock Homer unconscious with a mallet in apparent imitation of an Itchy and Scratchy cartoon, launches a campaign to clean up the show, writing letters, organizing protests, attracting media attention, and eventually succeeding in getting the cartoon reformed into a gentler, more wholesome product. The episode's satirical structure is elegant. Marge's campaign works, the violence is removed, and the result is that children stop watching Itchy and Scratchy altogether and go outside to play, which everyone agrees is wonderful. But then the episode pivots. Michelangelo's David is coming to Springfield for a museum tour, and conservative groups want to ban it for nudity. Marge is asked to join the campaign against the statue, and she refuses because she doesn't believe in censorship when it comes to art. The episode makes its point with the delicacy of a sledgehammer. The same logic that censors cartoon violence also censors great art, and you cannot selectively apply the principle of protecting audiences from offensive content without eventually applying it to things you love. The PTC complained about this episode. They complained about the violence in the framing device of Itchy and Scratchy. They complained about the statue. They complained about the meta-commentary on censorship itself, which they characterized as the show attacking legitimate parental concern rather than engaging with it honestly. The writers took notes and continued. The episode Sideshow Bob Roberts, from Season 6, is another example of the show going further than most primetime programs would dare. Sideshow Bob, the cultured, educated, murderous nemesis of Bart Simpson, is released from prison through the efforts of a conservative talk radio host named Birch Barlow, a character so precisely modeled on Rush Limbaugh that it wasn't really modeling so much as direct portraiture. Bob then runs for mayor of Springfield on a platform of family values and wins through systematic election fraud. The episode depicts a conservative political campaign as built on a foundation of crime and deceit, presents talk radio as a propaganda vehicle for bad actors, and ends with the fraud being exposed through the investigative efforts of an 8-year-old girl. This was 1994. Rush Limbaugh was at the peak of his cultural influence. The Republican Party had just engineered the contract with America and was about to win a historic midterm election. And The Simpsons ran an episode where a character transparently modeled on the most powerful voice in conservative media freed a convicted criminal who then won an election by cheating and was brought down by a child. The hate mail was significant. The network received complaints. Birch Barlow's appearance became a talking point in political media for weeks. The show did not apologize. In fact, what happened in the wake of that episode illustrates something essential about how The Simpsons understood its own cultural position in the 1990s. The writers were not, as their critics sometimes claimed, simply trying to generate outrage for its own sake. They were operating from a genuine satirical intelligence that had specific targets and specific arguments, and they were making those arguments in a comedic form because comedy, as they understood it, was the most efficient and most penetrating vehicle for political observation that American culture had access to. You could write an op-ed about election fraud and talk radio propaganda, and people who disagreed with you would stop reading after the third paragraph. You could put those same arguments into the mouth of Sideshow Bob and frame them as a story about a cartoon villain, and millions of people, including people who might not otherwise have engaged with the political content at all, would watch it to the end. That understanding that comedy could do political work, that earnest political commentary could not, was something the best writers at The Simpsons shared with a tradition going back to Jonathan Swift and Mark Twain and, in television terms, to Norman Lear's work on All in the Family and The Jeffersons in the 1970s. But The Simpsons was doing it at a scale and with a consistency that hadn't been attempted before in animation. And the parents' groups that organized against it were, in a way, acknowledging the power of what the show was doing by treating it as a genuine threat. The Conan O'Brien years add another layer to this story that often gets overlooked in the broader history of the show's controversies. O'Brien, who would later become famous as a late-night host, but who spent several formative years as a writer and producer on The Simpsons during seasons 3, 4, and 5, had a sensibility that pushed the show toward a particular kind of comedy that balanced absurdism with genuine darkness. His episodes tend to be among the most formally inventive and the most emotionally risky of the Golden Age. He was willing to go places that other writers hesitated at. The episode Marge vs. the Monorail, written by O'Brien and often cited as one of the greatest episodes in the series, is superficially a parody of The Music Man. A con man sells a monorail to Springfield, and Homer becomes its conductor. But the episode's satirical targets are precise and pointed. The stupidity of civic boosterism, the ease with which charismatic nonsense defeats practical sense in public debate, the specific way that American communities can be manipulated into spending money on things that don't work by charlatans who understand that people want to believe in something exciting. The monorail is a metaphor, and it's not a comfortable one. It suggests that the democratic process, when applied to genuinely technical questions, produces results determined more by entertainment value than by competence or safety. That's a sharp thing to say in a comedy episode about a cartoon town's public transit. It's the kind of observation that hits differently if you're paying attention, and the show's best writers always wrote for the people who were paying attention, even while the episodes worked perfectly well as pure entertainment for those who weren't. The episode Homer Badman from Season 6 engaged with another controversy that was very much alive in 1994. The panic around sexual harassment allegations and the specific way that media coverage could destroy a person's reputation before any facts had been established. Homer is accused of sexual harassment by a graduate student babysitter after he grabs what he believes is a rare candy off her backside. The accusation spreads through the media. Homer becomes the subject of a tabloid television expose, a protest forms outside his house, and his reputation is destroyed despite the fact that he is innocent and the harassment was genuinely accidental. The episode makes no attempt to be comfortable about any of this. It shows the media as predatory and simplistic, driven by the story it wants to tell rather than the truth. It shows how quickly public opinion can be turned against an individual by a single allegation, regardless of evidence. And it shows Homer stupid, hapless, genuinely innocent in this case, unable to navigate a media environment that has no interest in his actual story. The candy, which turns out to be a piece of extremely rare confectionery that Homer was desperately trying to retrieve, is ultimately vindicated by a documentary filmmaker who happens to have been following the babysitter. The truth comes out. Homer is exonerated. But the episode doesn't celebrate this. The final scene is troubling, because the same media that destroyed Homer's reputation reverses course and celebrates his vindication with the same breathless enthusiasm it had previously directed at his condemnation. Nothing has been learned. The machine continues. Homer is fine this week, and it will eat someone else next week. Parents groups complained about Homer Badman because of a brief segment that showed an adult entertainment program called Rock Bottom conducting an interview with Homer that edits his words to make him sound guilty. The segment was considered too explicitly sexual for a show that aired at 8 p.m. The writers noted the complaint and filed it. There is something almost moving, in retrospect, about the sheer volume of complaints that various organizations generated about The Simpsons during its prime years, because the complaints so consistently missed what was actually being said. The PTC would object to a moment of cartoon violence and not notice that the episode was a meditation on the ethics of vigilante justice. A religious organization would write letters about a joke at the expense of Christianity and not engage with the fact that the same episode contained one of the most sincere and complex explorations of personal faith that American television had produced. Conservative media would attack the show's political episodes as liberal propaganda and not acknowledge that many of those same episodes were equally critical of the left that Birch Barlow's counterpart in the Springfield universe was often a sanctimonious environmentalist or a politically correct crusader who was just as hollow, just as self-serving, and just as disconnected from actual human experience as the conservative villain. The Simpsons, at its best, was not a liberal show. It was a skeptical show, and the difference matters enormously. A liberal show has a political home and defends it. A skeptical show is suspicious of all political homes, including its own. The writers of The Simpsons were, collectively, a group of highly educated people from a variety of backgrounds who had in common a deep suspicion of power, a low tolerance for hypocrisy, and a genuine belief that the most interesting thing you could do with a comedy was make it true. That combination made the show a target for everyone, not just the parents' groups. Political operatives of every stripe found things to be offended by, religious communities found their sacred cows occasionally gored, and the entertainment industry itself came in for sustained satirical punishment throughout the show's run. The episode Bart Sells His Soul from Season 7 attracted significant complaints from Christian groups who felt it mocked the religious concept of the soul and suggested that children were trading spiritual matters for material ones. The episode is actually one of the show's most genuinely moving and spiritually serious pieces of work. It takes the concept of the soul with absolute seriousness and uses a child's flippant transaction with it to explore what it means to feel connected to something beyond the self. Bart sells his soul to Milhouse for $5 to prove he doesn't believe in it, and then spends the rest of the episode being haunted by the experience of feeling soulless in ways that he can't quite articulate. He can't find anything funny. Dogs won't come to him. He dreams of himself alone in a boat on a gray lake while everyone else he knows floats past with their souls beside them, and his boat is empty. He buys his soul back from Milhouse in the end, but not directly. Lisa has already purchased it and gives it back to him. And when he goes to sleep that night holding the piece of paper, the final image is of him drifting off with a small smile on his face, the emptiness gone. It is a perfect, quiet ending for an episode that had been playing out as a comedy, and the Christian groups who complained about it had, with their objection, demonstrated that they found the concept of a soul being sold more offensive as a comedy bit than as a spiritual inquiry, which is itself a kind of interesting theological position. The parents' groups, the PTC, the letter writers and the boycott organizers and the FCC complaint filers, all of them were, in their own way, responding to something real about The Simpsons. The show was doing something that they could sense was significant, even if their identification of what exactly it was doing tended to stop at the surface level. It was going too far, they said. And they were right. The show was going too far. That was the whole point. Section 3. The deaths that weren't supposed to happen. There is a specific cruelty to killing someone in a comedy. It's the kind of creative decision that only works if the comedy has been doing its job properly up to that point, building attachment, creating genuine fondness, making the audience care about characters who exist inside a world of exaggeration and impossibility. If the comedy is doing its job, the deaths land. They land in the way that only unexpected grief can land. Suddenly, personally, and with a weight that seems disproportionate to what you are watching. The Simpsons has killed characters that people loved, and it has done so in ways that range from accidental to deliberate, from contractual to creative, from genuinely moving to genuinely controversial. The deaths in this show are a small archive of moments when the writers decided that comedy could hold grief without collapsing under it, that a cartoon family could lose someone real and the audience would not simply move on, but would feel something that persisted beyond the credits. Let's begin with the first loss that the show treated as truly irreversible, because it established the template for everything that followed. Bleeding Gums Murphy is a jazz musician who appears in the first season of The Simpsons in an episode called Moaning Lisa. He is encountered by Lisa on a bridge late at night, where she has gone because she is profoundly sad, in a way she can't explain. The episode is one of the earliest in the show's history to take the interior life of an 8-year-old girl with absolute seriousness, and it remains, decades later, one of the most striking pieces of children's television ever made for its willingness to not resolve Lisa's sadness with a lesson, or a hug, or a joke. Bleeding Gums Murphy plays saxophone with Lisa on the bridge and teaches her that music is how you express what you can't say out loud, and the sequence is so gentle and so precisely observed that it functions as a kind of artistic statement about what the show was trying to do. Murphy appears occasionally over the next several seasons as a background figure in Lisa's musical life. He plays at the jazz bar, he shows up in her dreams, he represents something important to her about authenticity and expression, and the value of art that exists outside commercial success. He is not a major character. He does not carry plots. But he is loved by Lisa and by the audience in the specific way that minor characters become loved when they represent something larger than themselves. In the Season 6 episode Round Springfield, Bleeding Gums Murphy dies. He dies in a hospital, having been sick for some time, in a way that the show treats with complete seriousness. Lisa finds out after the fact, having not known he was ill, and the episode follows her grief, her attempts to get his music heard, to honor what he meant to her, to process the loss of someone who had shown her something true about herself. The episode ends with Murphy's face appearing in the clouds during a thunderstorm, and the image walks the line between sincere and absurd, with the particular grace that the show was capable of in its best moments. landing on the side of sincere without quite abandoning the absurd. The death of Bleeding Gums Murphy was the show's first practice at something it would have to do more seriously not long afterward. It was a test of whether the audience would accept loss inside a comedy. And the answer, both in ratings and in the cultural response, was yes. What came next was not a creative decision at all. It was a contract dispute that became a tragedy. Maude Flanders was the wife of Ned Flanders, the cheerful, mildly exasperated mother of Rod and Todd, a character who had existed at the margins of the show for its entire run as a warm counterpart to Ned's perhaps excessive religiosity. She was voiced by Maggie Roswell, who had provided the character's voice since the show's beginning. In 1999, a dispute over pay and travel expenses, Roswell had moved from Los Angeles to Colorado and was being asked to fly back to record episodes, for which she was being compensated at a rate she found inadequate, resulted in Roswell leaving the show. The writers faced a choice. They could recast the character. They could write Maude out of storylines gradually, reducing her presence over time. Or they could do something that no primetime animated show had done with a major supporting character since the medium's earliest days. They could kill her. They killed her. The episode They Saved Lisa's Brain, which aired in 1999, contains a brief moment at a Springfield Speedway where Maude Flanders is knocked from the bleachers by a t-shirt cannon, specifically a t-shirt cannon that Homer causes to be misfired by dodging the projectiles himself. She falls. The camera cuts away, and Maude Flanders is dead. The actual episode that dealt with the aftermath, Alone Again, Natura Diddly, from season 11 became one of the most discussed in the show's history, and not entirely for positive reasons. The episode follows Ned's grief with a seriousness that the show usually reserved for Lisa's storylines, and Dan Castellanetta's performance as Homer struggling to support his neighbor in ways that Homer is fundamentally not equipped for is genuinely affecting. But the episode also generated significant controversy because of how it handled Ned's eventual movement toward dating again, a storyline that felt to many viewers as though it was moving too fast, using Maude's death as a plot mechanism, rather than honoring it as the loss of a person who had existed in the show for a decade. Maggie Roswell later returned to the show in 2002 after a salary agreement was reached, but Maude was not resurrected. Her death remained permanent. She became part of the show's history in a way that was unusual for a primetime comedy, a genuine absence, a place at the table that stayed empty. The death that generated the most sustained intellectual interest, though the death that fans and critics still discuss most frequently when this topic comes up, was not a main character at all. It was a man named Frank Grimes. Frank Grimes appears in exactly one episode, the Season 8 episode Homer's Enemy. He is introduced as a man who has struggled for everything he has, who grew up in poverty, who educated himself through night school, who earned his engineering degree through effort and sacrifice and years of work. He is, by every conventional measure, the kind of person that American mythology is supposed to celebrate. Self-made, hardworking, competent, morally serious. He gets a job at the Springfield nuclear power plant and immediately encounters Homer Simpson. Frank Grimes cannot understand Homer Simpson. He cannot understand how a man who sleeps at his workstation, who has demonstrated multiple times that he does not understand basic safety protocols, who is so obviously and completely incompetent at his stated job, can be employed at all, let alone can apparently be happy, surrounded by a loving family, living in a comfortable house, with friends and community and a life that, by any external measure, is a successful one. Grimes tries to expose Homer. He tries to make the people around Homer see what he sees the fundamental wrongness of this situation, the injustice of a world in which effort and competence and responsibility are not rewarded, while Homer's particular combination of luck and obliviousness somehow produces a comfortable life. He fails. Nobody sees what he sees. Homer doesn't even understand that he has an enemy. The episode builds toward a climax in which Grimes, driven to a breakdown by his inability to make anyone acknowledge the reality he is pointing at, mimics Homer's behavior, grabbing live electrical wires without safety gloves, behaving as Homer would behave, and is killed by the resulting electrocution. Homer falls asleep at Grimes's funeral. He mumbles something about cold beer. The congregation laughs. The episode ends. Frank Grimes's death is the darkest joke The Simpsons ever made. It is a joke about the futility of merit. It is a joke about the gap between how the world is supposed to work and how it actually works, and it makes that joke by killing the person who most clearly sees the gap. Grimes dies because he can see the truth and cannot get anyone else to see it with him, and the show presents this as both a comedy and a tragedy, and is absolutely serious about both readings simultaneously. The episode was controversial within the show's own production. Some writers felt it was too dark. Some felt it was anti-Homer in a way that undermined the audience's relationship with the character they had been watching for 8 seasons. The fan response when the episode aired was divided. Some viewers found it profoundly uncomfortable. Some found it the most honest thing the show had ever done. Over the years, the consensus has shifted dramatically toward the latter. Homer's Enemy is now regularly cited as one of the greatest episodes in the series, precisely because of its willingness to look at Homer Simpson without the softening warmth of the show's usual perspective and acknowledge that there is something genuinely disturbing about the world he represents. Grimes was brought back, briefly and absurdly, in a later Treehouse of Horror segment as a zombie with a grudge. But his only real appearance, remains the one where he died, and the death remains unresolved in the show's emotional architecture. There was no funeral episode for Frank Grimes the way there was for Maude Flanders. No character mentioned his name in a later episode with particular weight. He came and he saw clearly, and he was destroyed by what he saw. And the show moved on. Which was, in a terrible way, exactly the point. Dr. Marvin Monroe, the pompous, frequently ineffectual therapist who treats the Simpson family in early episodes, simply disappeared. The actor who voiced him, Harry Shearer, found the character's voice damaging to his vocal cords and stopped performing him. The show subsequently ran a joke in which a character passes the doctor. Marvin Monroe Memorial Hospital, implying he had died, though this was never explicitly confirmed. He eventually returned, voice intact, in a later episode, with no explanation of where he had been or what the memorial building was about. Springfield, as always, chose not to ask. The deaths in The Simpsons constitute a kind of shadow history of the show, a record of the choices that were made, the people who left, the characters who were removed from the equation either by creative decision or by the messiness of real-world circumstances. Each death tells you something about the show at the moment it happened, where it was willing to go, what it believed comedy could hold, how seriously it took the people who existed in its cartoon world. And the deaths that landed hardest, that echoed longest, were the ones where the writers refused to look away, where they let the grief exist without immediately resolving it into something comfortable. That refusal is what made them matter. That refusal is what made them too much. And exactly right. Section 4. The celebrity episodes that caused real damage. The guest star is a staple of long-running television. Every show that survives past its 5th season discovers the guest star as a mechanism for generating excitement, for attracting viewers who might have drifted away, for creating episodes that feel like events rather than installments. The celebrity visit has been part of American television since the medium began. But The Simpsons did something with celebrity guest appearances that no show had done before, and that most shows still haven't quite replicated. From the beginning, the show treated celebrities not as attractions to be displayed, but as material to be used, and more specifically, as material to be used against themselves. The Simpsons consistently booked famous people and then put them in situations that were either self-deprecating or politically pointed, or both. Celebrities appeared on The Simpsons and played versions of themselves that were slightly more honest than the versions they presented to the world, and the show trusted the audience to understand the gap between the persona and the performance. This created a specific kind of controversy that was different from the controversies generated by the show's political satire or its treatment of violence or religion. Celebrity controversy was personal. It involved real people and their real reputations and, in some cases, their real feelings about what the show had done with their image. The clearest example of a celebrity episode causing lasting damage in the reputational sense, damage in the relationship between a famous person and the audience's perception of them, is the episode in which Aerosmith appeared. The show had a long history of rock music guest appearances, and Aerosmith's appearance in the Season 3 episode Flaming Moe's generated mostly positive attention. The band played themselves as barflies at Moe's Tavern and were charming and funny and clearly understood that the joke was partly on them. But the more pointed celebrity appearances, the ones that caused real friction, involved figures who were being used as vehicles for the show's satirical arguments in ways that went beyond simple self-deprecation. The episode Bart Gets Famous from Season 5 is a meditation on the specific machinery of celebrity that is almost unbearably accurate in its depiction of how cultural stardom is manufactured, maintained, and destroyed. Bart becomes famous for accidentally saying, "I didn't do it," during a live television appearance. The phrase becomes a national catchphrase. He is booked onto every talk show and variety program in the country, and then the public moves on and he is forgotten. The episode ends with Bart accepting the transience of fame with a philosophical equanimity that is surprisingly moving for a 10-year-old cartoon character. What made this episode land differently from a standard celebrity satire is that it wasn't really about a specific celebrity, it was about celebrity as a system, as an industrial process that produces and disposes of famous people with the same efficiency and the same indifference that a factory produces and disposes of consumer products. That argument is not a gentle one. It implicates not just the celebrities, but the audience. The viewers who made Bart famous in the episode's fiction are indistinguishable from the viewers who were watching the episode itself. The Apu controversy deserves its own section and will receive one, but it's worth introducing here as the most significant example of a character whose origins in comedic caricature eventually collided with genuine harm. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalan, the owner of the Quick E-Mart, has been a fixture of The Simpsons since the beginning. He is voiced by Hank Azaria, a white actor who performs the character in a thick Indian accent and with a manner that is, by any honest accounting, a caricature. Apu is also, genuinely and consistently, one of the most warmly drawn characters in the show. He is intelligent, entrepreneurial, devoted to his family, knowledgeable about American culture, and presented throughout the show's history with evident affection. The writers liked Apu. The audience liked Apu. For 20 years, nobody with a significant platform raised a serious objection to the character. The objection, when it arrived through the work of comedian Hari Kondabolu, whose 2017 documentary, The Problem with Apu, examined what it meant to grow up as an Indian American. While the most famous Indian character on American television was a caricature performed by a white actor in a funny accent, Kondabolu's argument was not that Apu was a villain or that the people who created him were malicious. His argument was more uncomfortable than that the character had functioned for generations of South Asian Americans as a template for the way they were perceived and mocked by their peers. That children had been called Apu in schoolyards. That the accent had been used against real people. That the affectionate intent of the creators did not erase the real-world effects of the depiction. The show's initial response to the documentary was a misfire. In the episode No Good Read Goes Unpunished, Lisa breaks the fourth wall and acknowledges the controversy directly, saying to the camera that some things from the past don't age well, and sometimes the only answer is, "I don't know." The episode then cuts to Marge putting a piece of paper into a drawer and closing it, which reads as a gesture of dismissal, "We don't know what to do, so we're filing it away." The backlash to this response was significant. Kondabolu called it a straight-up cop-out and expressed frustration that the show had chosen to acknowledge the issue without engaging with it. Other voices in the South Asian American community found the fourth wall moment condescending a way of seeming self-aware without actually changing anything. What followed was a slow, somewhat painful process of reconsideration. Hank Azaria eventually stepped away from the role, announcing in 2021 that he would no longer voice Apu. He subsequently made efforts to personally apologize to members of the South Asian American community, describing visits to Indian American actors and community members to listen to their experiences. The apologies were genuine and were largely received as such, though the broader question of what the show should do with the character going forward remained unresolved. Apu has appeared very rarely since Azaria's departure. The character has not been recast. He exists in a kind of limbo present in the world of the show, but largely silent within it. A ghost of a controversy that the show hasn't quite finished having. The Krusty the Clown episodes offer a different kind of celebrity-adjacent controversy, one rooted not in representation but in the show's willingness to depict professional entertainers as profoundly, specifically miserable human beings. Krusty is a children's entertainer who is secretly almost everything children's entertainers are not supposed to be. He is cynical, financially reckless, addicted to gambling and cigarettes and various substances, cruel to his colleagues, dismissive of his audience, and sustained only by a vanity so deep that it has become indistinguishable from genuine suffering. He is also, the show quietly insists, genuinely talented, a real comedian, a real performer, capable of moments of authentic connection with his audience that cut through the professional cynicism and reveal something true underneath. The comedy of Krusty is the comedy of show business honesty, and the show has been doing it for 36 years without pulling the punch. Krusty has faked his death, been investigated for tax fraud, lost and regained his television show multiple times, confronted his distant and disappointed rabbi father, and navigated a parasocial relationship with Bart that is one of the show's most interesting ongoing dynamics. A child who idolizes an entertainer who barely acknowledges that he exists, and whose idolization of the entertainer survives every disillusionment intact. The episode Krusty Gets Cancelled from Season 4 is the sharpest version of this satire. Krusty is driven off the air by a ventriloquist's dummy named Gabbo, who delivers his jokes in a cruder, more offensive package, and the episode uses Krusty's fall and recovery to anatomize the entertainment industry's relationship with talent, novelty, and disposability. The guest list for Krusty's comeback special includes Bette Midler, Johnny Carson, Hugh Hefner, Elizabeth Taylor, Luke Perry, and Barry White, all of whom appear as themselves in ways that range from self-deprecating to genuinely absurdist. Carson, in particular, appears in a moment that is both funny and slightly devastating. The late-night host, who defined an era of American television, appearing on a cartoon show about a failing clown's comeback and committing fully to the comedy of his own displacement. The Elizabeth Taylor appearance is worth noting separately because it connects to the Maggie storyline. Taylor voiced Maggie's first word, Daddy, in an earlier episode, and her appearance in Krusty Gets Cancelled is partly a callback to that connection. Taylor was, by most accounts, a good sport about the show's use of her image and was a genuine fan of the program. But her willingness to participate in what was essentially a comedy about celebrity obsolescence added a particular poignancy to her cameo. Here was one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood history, appearing on a cartoon as a living joke about the impermanence of stardom. The Michael Jackson situation, already touched on in the first section, belongs here too in a different register. What made the Stark raving dad controversy so lasting was not just the revelation about Jackson's behavior that came decades later. It was what the episode's existence revealed about the relationship between The Simpsons and celebrity in general. Jackson wanted to appear on the show because appearing on the show was, by the early 1990s, a signal of cultural significance. The show had achieved a kind of critical mass by Season 3, where the celebrities it featured were not lending their prestige to the program, they were borrowing something from it. Being on The Simpsons meant something, and what it meant, paradoxically, was that you were secure enough in your fame to be willing to be made fun of. Jackson was the most famous person in the world. He appeared on The Simpsons under a false name, playing a character in a psychiatric institution who might or might not be who he says he is. The joke was about identity, about the gap between public persona and private self, about the impossibility of knowing who a famous person actually is underneath the image they project. It was the perfect Simpsons celebrity episode in its original conception, a famous person using the show to say something honest about what it felt like to be them. What came after the documentary, the retirement of the episode, the debates about artistic legacy and historical context, is a story about what happens when the honest thing a famous person was trying to say turns out to have been incomplete in ways that matter. That's the nature of celebrity controversy in The Simpsons. The show went after fame with a genuine intelligence and a genuine affection that were inseparable from each other, and the results were sometimes revelatory and sometimes damaging, and sometimes both at once. The show understood that celebrity was a kind of shared fiction, a story that famous people and their audiences told together, and it was endlessly curious about what happened when that story was interrupted. Sometimes the interruption was funny, sometimes it was uncomfortable, and sometimes, as with Apu and Michael Jackson, the interruption revealed something that the story had been covering up for a very long time. Section 5. The political episodes that split the country. There is a moment in the Season 4 episode Camp Krusty when a group of children, having organized a rebellion against the conditions at their summer camp, march on the camp's administrative center carrying a flag and chanting revolutionary slogans. The sequence is a clear visual reference to Lord of the Flies, and the children's expressions are those of people who have been pushed past their tolerance for authority and have decided to stop being reasonable about it. It is funny. It is also a fairly pointed depiction of how political resistance works. The conditions have to become bad enough, and the people in charge have to be oblivious enough. And then something tips. The Simpsons has been making political arguments since its first season. Some of them have been gentle and bipartisan in their skepticism satire, aimed at the general stupidity of the political process, rather than at any specific ideological position. Some of them have been pointed and specific in ways that made clear the show had a particular target and was not interested in being gentle about it. And some of them have been so specifically right about something happening in American politics that they crossed from satire into something closer to prophecy. Though, as we discussed in the context of the show's famous predictions, prophecy and coincidence are harder to distinguish at 30 years' distance than they seem from the moment of apparent confirmation. The episode that established the template for The Simpsons' political ambition was Bart vs. Thanksgiving from Season 2, which is not a political episode in the conventional sense, but makes a political argument in the way that the best Simpsons episodes make their arguments by showing you something true about family and economic reality without underlining it or explaining it. Bart runs away after accidentally destroying Lisa's Thanksgiving centerpiece, and he ends up at a homeless shelter where he watches real suffering with a dawning, uncomfortable awareness of what the world actually contains. The episode doesn't moralize. It just shows you the shelter and the people in it, and lets Bart's confusion and guilt speak for the show's larger observation about what American prosperity looks like from the outside. But it was the Season 4 episode, Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, that announced the show's willingness to engage with political content directly and without the protection of allegory. Lisa wins an essay contest on the theme of American democracy and travels to Washington, D.C., where she witnesses a congressman accepting a bribe from a lobbyist in exchange for opening a national forest to logging. Her faith in American democracy is shattered. She writes a new essay called Cesspool on the Potomac. The essay causes a scandal. The scandal triggers a congressional investigation. The congressman is removed from office, and by the end of the episode, Lisa's faith in American democracy has been restored not because corruption doesn't exist, but because the system caught the corrupt person and removed him, which is what the system is supposed to do. The episode aired in 1991 and was praised universally at the time for its wit and its civics lesson. It was taught in some schools as an accessible introduction to how American government is supposed to function. Watching it now, from a distance of 30-plus years, the ending the system works, the corrupt congressman is punished, Lisa's faith is restored, has a quality of sadness about it that is not intentional, but is inescapable. The episode is a document of a moment when it was still possible to make that argument with a straight face on primetime television. Something has happened to that argument in the intervening years that the episode couldn't have anticipated. The election episodes deserve particular attention. The Simpsons has returned to electoral politics repeatedly across its run, and the results have ranged from elegant satire to something more complicated. Sideshow Bob Roberts, mentioned in the previous section, was the first major electoral episode and remains arguably the sharpest. But it was the episode Bart Mangled Banner, from Season 15, that generated the most intense political controversy in the show's history. The episode, which aired in 2004 during the period of heightened American nationalism that followed September 11th, features Bart accidentally mooning the American flag at a Springfield sports event. The incident goes national. The Simpsons family is labeled unpatriotic and subjected to a campaign of public shaming and social pressure that is depicted with a genuine satirical venom that the show hadn't quite aimed at patriotic culture before. The episode ends with the entire Simpson family renouncing their citizenship and moving to France, a conclusion that was either brilliant or appalling depending on your political position in 2004. Fox's Standards and Practices Department pushed back significantly on the episode. Network executives were concerned about the potential for advertiser backlash and public controversy during a particularly politically sensitive moment in American life. The showrunner at the time, Al Jean, and the writing staff defended the episode. The episode aired largely as written, though the network added a disclaimer during the broadcast noting that the views expressed were satirical. The disclaimer itself became a controversy. Putting a disclaimer on a satire is a slightly paradoxical act. It signals to the audience that what they're watching is not sincere, which is something that should be evident from the fact that they're watching a cartoon, but which apparently required explicit confirmation in 2004. The disclaimer was interpreted by critics of the episode as the network covering itself from political blowback, and by defenders of the episode as a sign that the satire had landed close enough to reality that someone felt threatened by it. The most politically significant moment in the show's history, though the one that resonates most fully across the entire arc of American politics from the show's debut to the present, is the episode Bart to the Future, from season 11, which aired in the year 2000, and imagined a future in which Donald Trump had been President of the United States and left the country in financial ruin, with President Lisa Simpson inheriting an empty treasury and a chaos of debt. The episode used Trump because the writers had been watching Trump's public flirtations with presidential ambitions for years. He had publicly considered running in 1988 and again in 1999, when Bart to the Future was being written, and because the writers, consistent with their general approach to political satire, were extrapolating an existing trajectory to its logical endpoint. The joke wasn't a guess. It was an observation about where certain tendencies in American celebrity culture and political culture were converging. When Trump actually won the presidency in 2016, the clip circulated everywhere. The show issued statements. Dan Greeny, who wrote Bart to the Future, gave interviews about the prediction. The writer Mike Reiss explained that the episode was a warning to America about the dangers of electing celebrity outsiders without political experience. And the cultural response to the apparent prediction, the amazement, the unease, the circulation of the clip as though it were evidence of something supernatural, told its own story about the state of American political confidence in 2016. The Simpsons had not predicted Trump's presidency. As we've already established, they had written a satirical joke based on real observations about real tendencies in American culture. But the reason the clip resonated so powerfully in 2016 was not because the show had seen the future. It was because the observation the show had made in 2000 about celebrity, politics, and the erosion of traditional gatekeepers had turned out to be accurate in ways that went beyond what the writers had intended or anticipated. The joke had been funnier than it was supposed to be. The Fox News episodes are their own chapter in this history. The Simpsons airs on Fox. Fox News, the cable network owned by the same company, was launched in 1996, and by the early 2000s, had become one of the most culturally powerful and politically influential media organizations in American history. The relationship between the show and the network that broadcast it was always complicated. Fox gave the show significant creative freedom in exchange for the ratings and cultural prestige it brought, but that freedom had limits, and one of the places where those limits were most consistently tested was in the show's treatment of Fox News itself. The episode Mr. Spritz Goes to Washington from season 14 features the Fox News network appearing as a character in the episode. The show depicts a chyron crawling across a Fox News broadcast with the message, "Democrats a threat to all we hold dear," and oil slicks found to keep sea lions young and supple. The episode aired without the disclaimers that had accompanied Bart Mangled Banner, and the satirical portrayal of Fox News's coverage style was precise enough that the network's own executives reportedly raised concerns. What made the Fox News appearances particularly charged was the structural absurdity of the situation. A show on Fox was satirizing Fox News, and both the show and the news network were owned by the same company. This was, in the words of one television critic, like a newspaper's entertainment section publishing a review calling the newspaper's editorial page intellectually dishonest. The show was biting the hand that fed it with enough force that the hand occasionally pulled back, and the negotiations between the show's creative team and the network standards department over the Fox News material constitute one of the more interesting unreported stories in the history of American broadcasting. The political episodes that split the country were doing so because they were reflecting a country that was splitting along lines of ideology, identity, media consumption, and basic disagreement about facts that was becoming more intense with each election cycle. The show couldn't help being part of that process because the show had always been interested in the process of how Americans formed and expressed their political identities. And what the political episodes demonstrate across 36 seasons is the trajectory of that interest. From gentle civic satire in the early years to something sharper and angrier in the middle years to something more uncertain and more melancholy in the recent decades, as the satirical targets became harder to distinguish from the reality they were supposed to be exaggerating, when reality is already the joke, satire has a difficult time finding its angle. The Simpsons has been wrestling with this problem for the better part of 20 years, and the political episodes of its later seasons reflect that wrestling in ways that are sometimes brilliant and sometimes exhausted. But even in the later seasons, even when the show has clearly been struggling with how to engage with a political environment that has outrun its satirical vocabulary, there are moments of genuine accuracy and genuine courage that remind you what the show was built to do. And what it was built to do was always, in some essential way, go too far. Section 6. The religious episodes that courted outrage. If you want to understand the specific way The Simpsons handles religion, the best starting point is not the episodes that generated controversy. The best starting point is the episodes that got religion exactly right, that treated faith with a seriousness and a complexity that most of American entertainment has never managed, because understanding what the show got right about religion makes it clearer why. The moments when it went further generated the responses they did. Homer the Heretic, from Season 4, is the one. It is the episode that established the show's theological position as clearly as anything in its history, and the position it establishes is not what you might expect from a show that regularly satirizes religious institutions and religious figures. The episode begins with Homer refusing to go to church on a cold winter morning, and what follows is not a satire of religion, it is a genuine, earnest, theologically serious examination of what it means to have a personal relationship with faith outside of institutional frameworks. Homer stays home while the family goes to church. He is warm, he watches football, he eats snacks. He cooks a waffle that burns in the shape of the state of Texas, which he takes as a sign. He dances to music with an ecstatic joy that the episode frames, without irony, as spiritual. He falls asleep and dreams of God, an actual God, a real divine presence who appears as a warm, personable figure with a beard and sandals, and an easy manner, and they have a conversation about Homer's spiritual life that is one of the strangest and most moving moments in the show's history. God tells Homer that he won't be punished for skipping church because he can worship anywhere, and that organized religion is one way of approaching the divine but not the only way. Homer wakes up. The house catches fire, he fell asleep with a lit cigar, and is saved by Ned Flanders, who has returned from church and pulls him from the smoke. The fire is also put out by Krusty the Clown, by Apu, by members of Springfield's Jewish, Hindu, and various other religious communities, all of whom converge on Homer's house to help. The episode ends with Homer considering the lesson of what just happened, that different faiths, working together, can accomplish what none of them could do alone. The episode is structured as a comedy, but its theological content is genuine. The God who appears in Homer's dream is not a joke. He's a presence that the show takes seriously warm, wise, slightly exasperated by Homer in the affectionate way that a parent is exasperated by a favorite child who keeps doing things wrong. And the episode's conclusion that faith is real and meaningful and worth pursuing, but that institutional religion is one vessel for something larger, not the thing itself, is a sophisticated theological position that many serious religious thinkers would recognize and respect. So, when The Simpsons generated religious controversy, it was generating it against a background of genuine theological engagement that most of its critics never quite acknowledged. The show wasn't simply hostile to religion. It was wrestling with religion in a way that required it to take religion seriously, and the wrestling sometimes led it to places that religious institutions found uncomfortable. Bart sells his soul, already discussed in the context of the Parents Group's controversy, is the most important religious episode the show produced, more important, in theological terms, than Homer the Heretic, because it engages with the concept of the soul not as a theological abstraction, but as an experiential reality. Bart sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. He doesn't believe the soul is real. He doesn't believe the transaction means anything. And then, The episode spends its running time demonstrating that something has changed, not in any way that can be pointed to or measured, but in Bart's fundamental experience of himself and the world. Animals don't respond to him. Automatic doors don't sense his presence. He dreams of himself alone while everyone else moves through the world with something beside them that he lacks. The genius of the episode is that it never explains whether Bart's soul is real in a metaphysical sense. The experience of its absence is real. Bart feels it, and the audience sees him feeling it. But the show never confirms that this is because a soul is an actual object that can be sold or bought. It might be that the psychological consequences of Bart's own choice to treat his soul as disposable are creating the experience of its loss. It might be that something genuinely metaphysical is happening. The episode holds both possibilities simultaneously without resolving them, which is a more sophisticated treatment of the concept of the soul than most serious philosophy produces. She of Little Faith from season 13 is the episode that generated the most explicit religious controversy. The episode follows Lisa's conversion to Buddhism after she discovers that her church has been commercialized. Corporate sponsors have been brought into the First Church of Springfield, their logos displayed during services, the pastor reduced to performing in front of advertisements for local businesses. Lisa walks out. She explores various options. She encounters Richard Gere at a Buddhist temple, is given a brief introduction to Buddhist practice, and converts. The controversy was immediate and multifaceted. Christian groups objected to the episode's depiction of Christianity as a commercial enterprise that had sold out its principles for sponsorship revenue. Buddhist groups, more interestingly, were generally positive about the episode but had concerns about the specific way Buddhist practice was presented, noting several inaccuracies in the brief tutorial that Lisa receives. The show's decision to have a major character convert to a non-Christian religion was itself noted as a significant departure from the norm for primetime American television, where the default religious background of main characters was generally assumed to be generically Protestant. Lisa's Buddhism, once established in She of Little Faith, became part of her character in a way that the show has been inconsistent about honoring in subsequent episodes. She is sometimes depicted practicing meditation or reflecting Buddhist principles. She is sometimes depicted in contexts that seem inconsistent with those principles without any acknowledgement of the inconsistency. This is partly a function of the floating timeline and the episodic reset, but it's also a function of the show's general ambivalence about committing to consequences that limit what it can do with a character in any given episode. The Catholic Church took particular notice of The Simpsons over the years. Italy's L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's official newspaper, published an editorial in 2010 that described Homer and Bart as true Catholics, a comment that was widely covered in the media and that the show's producers found simultaneously flattering, bewildering. The editorial argued that the Simpsons family's religious practice, including their regular church attendance and their genuine engagement with questions of faith and ethics, made them more authentically Catholic in their approach to religion than many characters in other popular American programs. The Vatican's newspaper calling The Simpsons Catholic was one of the stranger endorsements in the show's history. The endorsement was followed, a few years later, by a rather different response from a Catholic organization in Spain, which called for a boycott of the show following an episode that depicted a priest in an unflattering context. The show has always had a complicated relationship with organized Catholicism. In particular, it depicts Catholic ritual and practice with apparent familiarity and even affection in some episodes, and then goes after the institutional church with the same satirical edge it applies to all institutions in others. What makes the religious episodes distinctive, and what made the most controversial of them feel like genuine transgressions rather than mere provocations, is that the show clearly cared about the subject. You cannot satirize something effectively if you don't understand it, and the writers of The Simpsons understood religion, its language, its rituals, its emotional logic, its capacity for both genuine transcendence and institutional corruption, with a specificity that comes from either personal experience or very serious research, and probably from both. The Ned Flanders episodes represent the show's most sustained and complex engagement with religious faith as a lived practice, and they deserve to be understood together rather than individually. Flanders is the show's primary religious character, And what the show does with him across 36 seasons is one of its most sustained and quietly devastating achievements. It depicts a man who genuinely believes, who practices his faith as sincerely as it is possible to practice it, and who is rewarded for that sincerity by suffering not the suffering of a dramatic martyrdom, but the grinding, quiet, relentless suffering of a good man in a world that doesn't recognize goodness as something that deserves protection. We've discussed in a previous section the episode where it's revealed that Ned's kindness is the result of childhood behavioral conditioning rather than natural temperament. The religious implications of that revelation are worth dwelling on. If Ned's patience and charity and forgiveness are not expressions of genuine virtue, but of psychological programming, if the goodness is manufactured rather than chosen, then what does that mean for the faith that he expresses through those qualities? If Ned is kind because a doctor conditioned him to be kind, is his kindness still an expression of Christian love? The show doesn't answer this question directly. It raises it and moves on, as it often does with its deepest observations. But the question sits in the background of every subsequent Ned episode, making his relentless positivity a little harder to look at without discomfort. The God talks to Homer but not to Ned pattern alluded to at the end of the previous section is the most pointed religious observation the show has made across its entire run. God appears to Homer multiple times in various forms. They converse. Homer receives some version of divine guidance, even if he immediately ignores it or misinterprets it. And Ned, who prays every day, who structures his entire life around his faith, who has genuinely devoted himself to God's service, never receives an equivalent communication. The divine favor goes to the sinner. The righteous man is ignored. This is actually a very old theological observation. It appears in the book of Job, in various psalms, in the writings of nearly every tradition that has engaged seriously with the problem of why good people suffer and bad people prosper. The Simpsons arrived at it through the back door, through the comedy of the God-Homer relationship and the parallel comedy of Ned's suffering, and didn't draw attention to what it had found. But it's there, across the whole run of the show, this quiet theological argument dressed in yellow animation, that argument that the universe does not appear to be organized along the principles that religious faith would prefer, is as old as human thought. The Simpsons didn't invent it, but it made it accessible, made it funny, and made it personal in ways that serious philosophical or theological treatments rarely manage. And in doing so, it went too far for the people who felt that these questions should be handled with more solemnity, and not far enough for the people who felt the show was too respectful of faith to be taken seriously as a critique of it. It went precisely as far as it went, and that position, as usual, was exactly where it wanted to be. Section 7. The episodes that tackled real tragedy. There is a category of Simpsons episode that doesn't quite fit the show's usual mode. The episodes in this category are the ones where the writers looked at something that was happening in the real world. Something painful. Something that people didn't want to think about. Something that American entertainment had largely agreed to leave alone and decided to go there anyway. These episodes are not primarily comedies, though most of them contain funny moments. They are primarily honest, in a way that required the show to set aside the safety nets of cartoon absurdism and face something directly. The episode that begins this category most clearly is Saturdays of Thunder, from Season 3. But the episode that defines it is much later and much harder, The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, which aired in September 1997 and would become, 4 years later, one of the most complicated episodes in the show's archive. The episode, innocuous on its surface, involves Homer returning to New York City to retrieve his car, which has been wheel-clamped in the shadow of the World Trade Center. The episode is a New York comedy affectionate, slightly satirical, full of the specific texture of 1990s New York that the show had always been good at capturing. The World Trade Center appears prominently in it, because in 1997, the World Trade Center was simply there, part of the skyline, as ordinary and permanent as any building in the world. After the 11th of September 2001, the episode was pulled from rotation by Fox and held back for several years before being returned to syndication. It remains, when it appears, a strange artifact, a reminder of the specific way that catastrophic events can transform the meaning of cultural objects, making things that were purely comedic suddenly carry a weight of loss that was never part of the original intention. Watching Homer stand between the towers and complain about a parking ticket is funny. It is also now something else. Both things are true simultaneously, and the impossibility of resolving them into one clean response is part of what the episode represents when encountered now. The show engaged more directly with violence, specifically with the violence that was happening in American schools throughout the late 1990s, in ways that the network found deeply uncomfortable. Following the Columbine High School massacre in April 1999, Fox asked the production to pull several episodes that contained storylines involving guns, violence, and conflict in school settings. The show complied with some of these requests and pushed back on others, and the resulting negotiations between the creative team and the network's standards department lasted for months. The episode The Cartridge Family from Season 9 had aired in 1997 and featured Homer purchasing a handgun and the family's subsequent engagement with gun culture and gun safety. The episode is a nuanced piece of work. It doesn't simply condemn gun ownership or endorse it. It shows the multiple ways that a firearm enters and affects a household, including both the genuine sense of security it provides and the genuine danger it introduces. The NRA, depicted in the episode, is shown as a fraternal organization of men who use their meetings primarily as an excuse to shoot things and make explosions, which is played for comedy, but which also makes a point about the gap between the stated purposes of gun advocacy organizations and their actual cultural function. The episode was not pulled, but it was revisited in the post-Columbine conversations as an example of how the show had engaged with gun issues, sometimes cited by gun advocates as showing that ownership could be depicted fairly, and by gun control advocates as evidence that even thoughtful coverage of the issue missed the structural problems. The addiction episodes are a separate strand of the show's engagement with difficult realities, and they constitute some of the most honest writing about substance use that American television has produced in any genre. Duffless, from Season 4, follows Homer deciding to give up beer for a month after a drunken driving arrest, and the episode treats the withdrawal, the craving, the social pressure, and the eventual choice to return to drinking with a specificity that is uncomfortable in the best way. The comedy is real Homer hallucinating beer, Homer's inability to function in social situations without his usual chemical buffer, the increasingly specific fantasies he has about the first beer he'll drink when the month is over, but underneath the comedy is a portrait of dependency that doesn't simplify or sentimentalize what addiction actually feels. Like, the episode Selma's Choice from the same season shows Aunt Selma taking Bart and Lisa to Duff Gardens, an amusement park themed around beer, while Homer is sick at home from eating a 12-foot hoagie. The park is a satire of corporate amusement parks and the commodification of alcohol, but the episode's emotional core is Selma's growing awareness that she is alone, that the children she wanted have not arrived, that the opportunities for the life she wanted are narrowing. It's a comedy that contains real sadness without making the sadness the point, which is a harder thing to do than it sounds. The most unflinching addiction episode is Selma's Choice's spiritual companion, the Season 9 episode Bart Star, which is about sports culture and parental pressure, rather than alcohol, but which treats the dysfunction of a small-town sports culture with the same honesty. And the episode Diatribe of a Mad Housewife, which examines Marge's inner life and creative frustrations through the frame of her writing a romance novel. It is not about addiction, but is about the quiet suffocation of a life that doesn't leave room for the self, which is its own kind of dependency, though the show doesn't quite call it that. The episode that went furthest in engaging with the darkest realities of American family life is Marge Be Not Proud, from Season 7. Bart shoplifts a video game from a store and is caught by the store's security officer. The episode follows the consequence of this, not the legal consequence, which is minimal, but the emotional consequence of Marge knowing that Bart is capable of this kind of deceit and that she missed it. The central relationship in the episode is between Bart and Marge, and what the episode does with that relationship is devastating in a quiet way. Marge withdraws emotionally from Bart after she discovers what he did, not dramatically, not with a confrontation, just with a coldness that is more frightening to Bart than any punishment could be. The episode is about a child confronting the specific terror of having disappointed someone who loves them unconditionally, and discovering that unconditional love is not the same thing as unconditional approval. The ending involves Bart having a professional family portrait taken as a Christmas gift for Marge. And the moment when Marge looks at the photo and pulls Bart into a hug is one of the most emotionally clean moments the show has ever produced. It's earned by the episode's refusal to soften what preceded it. The 9/11 sensitivity was not the only way real tragedy intersected with the show's production. The episode's stark raving dad, as we've discussed, was retired following the revelations about Michael Jackson. But the show also faced, in its later seasons, the deaths of real people who had been part of its history, voice actors, writers, producers, and had to navigate how to continue when those absences were felt. Phil Hartman, who voiced the recurring characters Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, was murdered by his wife in 1998. The characters were retired in tribute, with the show declining to recast them on the grounds that Hartman's performances were so specific and so integral to the characters that replacing him would feel wrong. The retirement was a genuine act of mourning, quietly enacted without fanfare. Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz simply stopped appearing, and their absence became its own kind of tribute, the joke that stopped when the comedian was gone. Sam Simon, one of the show's original showrunners and one of the most important creative figures in its early history, died of colon cancer in 2015. The show paid tribute to him in the season 26 episode Let's Go Fly a Kite. But the tribute was complicated by the fact that Simon and Groening had had a painful and public falling out during the show's early years, and the relationship between them at the time of Simon's death was not warm. The episode's tribute was careful, and the care it took was itself a kind of commentary on the difficulty of publicly honoring someone with whom your history is complicated. Marcia Wallace, who voiced the recurring character Edna Krabappel, died in October 2013. Krabappel was retired from the show following her death, and the episode that addressed her absence, The Man Who Grew Too Much, from season 25 included a chalkboard gag that simply read, "We'll really miss you, Mrs. K," and a moment in which characters in Springfield observe a passing cloud shaped like Krabappel's face and laugh. It was the kind of moment that the show handled with a grace that is harder to execute than it looks genuine tribute inside a comedy, without tipping into sentimentality or bathos, honoring the real person and the fictional character simultaneously. These moments, when real death entered the animated world of Springfield, represent the most unambiguous instances of The Simpsons going too far further than a comedy was supposed to go, into the territory that comedies aren't built for, and managing it with varying degrees of grace and failure and genuine feeling. They're the moments where the show's capacity for honesty was tested not by its writers' willingness to confront difficult material, but by reality's insistence on arriving in places that no writer could have scripted. And the show, in each case, found a way to continue. Because that is what it does. The show always continues. The loop always keeps running. And whether that continuity is a triumph or a limitation is a question that each of the following sections will return to in its own way. Section 8. The Apu Problem and Race in Springfield. The Simpsons has always been a show about a specific version of American whiteness, the white, working-class, Midwestern family that occupies a particular position in the American imagination, neither wealthy enough to be aspirational nor poor enough to be tragic. The Simpsons are the middle, and America has always been fascinated by the middle. But Springfield is not a white town. Springfield is a community, and communities are diverse, and the show has been depicting the diversity of its fictional community since its earliest episodes. The question that the problem with Apu eventually made impossible to avoid asking is, when a show that is made primarily by white writers and voiced primarily by white actors depicts non-white characters, what responsibilities does it carry? This question did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived into a specific cultural moment, 2017, in the wake of a sustained national conversation about representation in media that had been building for years, and it arrived attached to a specific character, Apu, who had been part of the show for nearly 30 years. Let's establish the history clearly, because the history matters more than any single controversy. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilon was introduced in the Season 2 episode The Telltale Head in 1991, in a brief cameo at the Quick E-Mart. His full character was developed across subsequent seasons, and by the show's middle period he had become one of the most rounded and fully realized supporting characters in the series. He was married in a wedding episode that was genuinely moving to Manjula, an arranged marriage that evolved into a partnership depicted with affection and complexity. He had 8 children after a fertility treatment storyline. He had a doctoral degree from Caltech. He was a loyal friend to The Simpsons. He had genuine depth as a character, and the episodes that explored his relationship with his faith, his family, his immigrant experience, and his dreams for his children were among the best in the series. He was also voiced by Hank Azaria, doing an exaggerated Indian accent, and his character functioned in many episodes as a vessel for jokes about convenience stores, immigrant labor, and Indian culture that ranged from affectionate to caricaturistic to uncomfortable. Hari Kondabolu's 2017 documentary, The Problem with Apu, assembled a remarkable collection of South Asian American comedians, writers, and actors to speak about what the character had meant in their lives, specifically what it had cost them. Actor Kal Penn described being called Apu repeatedly throughout his childhood and career. Writer Aziz Ansari discussed the way the accent had been used to mock South Asian Americans in professional settings. Multiple participants described the particular frustration of seeing their community's representation on the most influential animated show in television history consist of a single character whose primary comic function was the accent and the convenience store. The documentary was careful to acknowledge the complexity of the situation. Kondabolu was not arguing that Apu was simply a racist creation or that the people who made him were malicious. He was arguing something more nuanced, that the character had existed for 30 years in a context where it was the dominant representation of South Asian identity in mainstream American entertainment, and that domination had consequences for real people that the show's creators had not adequately reckoned with. The show's initial response, the Lisa fourth wall moment, has already been described, but the aftermath deserves examination because it reveals something important about how the show processed criticism at a point in its history when it was less certain of its own judgments than it had been in the 1990s. The debate about Apu split the show's audience in a way that few previous controversies had managed. Some viewers felt that the criticism was valid and that the show had a responsibility to reckon with its own history on this point. Some felt that the character was being misrepresented, that Apu's complexity and the genuine affection with which he was drawn should be part of the conversation. Some felt that the broader principle of colorblind casting and voice acting, the convention by which actors of any background could voice characters of any background, was being challenged in a way that raised difficult questions about where the principle applied and where it didn't. The colorblind casting question is worth sitting with because it's not simple. Voice acting has traditionally operated under the assumption that the voice actor's body is irrelevant, that a white actor can voice a black character, or an Asian character, or an alien character without carrying the same representational weight as on-screen casting. This assumption was challenged by the Apu controversy, and it was subsequently challenged in other contexts. In 2020, following the national reconsideration of racial representation that accompanied the Black Lives Matter movement, both The Simpsons and Family Guy announced that non-black cast members would no longer voice black characters. The Simpsons specifically cited the Apu situation as part of the reasoning. The show's statement read, "Moving forward, The Simpsons will no longer have white actors voice non-white characters." This was a significant policy shift, and it was implemented. Hank Azaria left the role of Apu. Harry Shearer, who voiced Dr. Hibbert, a black character, stepped back from that role. Other adjustments were made. The character of Dr. Hibbert Springfield's calm, elegant, slightly exasperating physician who laughs at inappropriate moments was subsequently recast with Kevin Michael Richardson, a black actor. The recasting was accomplished without fanfare. Hibbert continued to appear in the show with his new voice. Apu's situation remained unresolved. The character has appeared only rarely since Azaria's departure, without a new voice actor announced, existing in a kind of limbo. The show has not killed Apu or explicitly retired him. He is simply less present, which is its own kind of statement. The Apu controversy was, in retrospect, the most significant creative reckoning in the show's history, more significant than the stark raving dad retirement, more significant than any of the FCC complaints or parental boycotts or political controversies. Because it required the show to ask a question about itself that it had never quite asked before. What is the cost of the comedy, and who is paying it? The Simpsons had always been willing to examine the costs of other things. Burns's empire has costs. Political corruption has costs. Institutional religion has costs. The show's satirical intelligence had been applied to all of these things and more, consistently and skillfully. But the cost of the show's own creative choices, the cost of the accents and the caricatures, and the white actors voicing characters of color, that was not something the show had examined with the same scrutiny it applied to the world outside itself. The Apu conversation forced it to begin. And whether the show has adequately completed that examination is something that remains genuinely open. The limbo of the character, the inconsistent application of the new casting policy, the absence of a meaningful storyline that engages with what the controversy revealed, all of it suggests that the examination is ongoing and unfinished. There are other racial and ethnic representation questions that deserve mention alongside the Apu situation. The character of Carl Carlson, one of Homer's best friends and co-workers at the plant, is a black man who has been a part of the show since its beginning. For most of the show's history, Carl was voiced by Harvey Fierstein and later by Hank Azaria, neither of whom is black. Carl was recast with Alex Desert in 2020 as part of the broader policy shift. His character has been developed more extensively in recent seasons, with episodes exploring his Icelandic ancestry and his family history in ways that attempt to give him the kind of depth that he arguably should have received decades earlier. The character of Fat Tony, the Springfield mob boss, an Italian-American stereotype performed with cheerful excess, is a different kind of representation question. Italian-American advocacy groups have periodically objected to the character's existence as a reinforcement of mafia stereotypes, though Fat Tony's depiction is so explicitly cartoonish and so affectionately drawn that the objections have tended to gain less traction than the Apu controversy. The show's depiction of Jewish characters is another strand of this history. Krusty the Clown is Jewish. His real name is Herschel Shmoykel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustovsky, and his relationship with his rabbi father, his ambivalence about his religious identity, and his complicated feelings about his cultural inheritance are explored in several episodes that are among the show's finest. The character was voiced by Dan Castellaneta, who is not Jewish, and this has not generated the same level of controversy as the Apu situation, a fact that itself invites reflection about which kinds of caricature American culture treats as acceptable and which kinds it doesn't. The history of race in Springfield is not a comfortable history. The show, made by people who were overwhelmingly white and educated and working in a specific cultural moment with specific blind spots, produced decades of content that did not examine its own representational choices with the rigor it brought to other kinds of examination. The Apu controversy revealed this, and the show's response to it has been imperfect and ongoing. What the show deserves credit for, and the credit is genuine, even if it comes alongside the criticism, is that when the criticism arrived with sufficient force, the show responded. It changed its casting policy. It acknowledged, at least in general terms, that it had not gotten everything right. It moved, even if it moved imperfectly and too slowly. The question of whether the response was adequate is one that will continue to be debated. But the fact of the response distinguishes the show from institutions that simply wait for controversy to blow over. The Apu question in the end is about the gap between intention and effect, between what the creators meant to do and what the work actually did in the world, over decades, to real people. The Simpsons has always been a show about that gap, about the distance between what people intend and what their actions produce, about the costs that are paid by people who didn't agree to pay them. It is somewhat fitting, and more than somewhat uncomfortable, that the show eventually found itself on the wrong side of the very analysis it had been applying to everything else. Section 9. The Final Frontier when The Simpsons Went After Itself. There is a particular kind of institutional courage that involves turning the satirical lens on the institution, doing the satirizing. Most organizations that are in the business of pointing out other people's hypocrisies and failures are not especially eager to point out their own. The Simpsons has done this throughout its history, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes inadequately, and sometimes in ways that are still reverberating. The behind-the-scenes history of the show is as turbulent as the show's own subject matter, and understanding it is essential to understanding what the show became and why it became that rather than something else. The history involves creative disagreements that became permanent fractures, contract disputes that played out in public, personality conflicts between people who were building something that neither they nor anyone else fully understood yet, and the particular pressures that come with sustaining a creative enterprise across decades that no creative enterprise had previously managed to sustain. Sam Simon is where this story begins, because Sam Simon is the most important person in the history of The Simpsons whom most viewers have never heard of, and because his departure from the show in 1993 represents the first and arguably most consequential of the show's many internal crises. Simon joined the show's production in its earliest days, alongside Matt Groening and James L. Brooks as one of the three executive producers and showrunners who shaped the show's initial identity. He had a background in the comedy writing rooms of shows like Taxi and Cheers, and he brought to The Simpsons a structural discipline and a comedic intelligence that were essential to the show's early success. He was also, by most accounts of the people who worked with him, an extremely difficult person to be in a room with, demanding, combative, prone to cruelty in the specific way that brilliant people sometimes are when they're convinced of their own superiority. The falling out between Simon and Groening was not clean or quick. It was the kind of slow deterioration that happens when two people with strong and incompatible visions are forced to share creative ownership of something they both love and both feel possessive about. By the show's fourth season, Simon had effectively departed. He retained his executive producer credit and continued to receive a share of the show's income, which would become, given the show's extraordinary commercial success, a very significant amount of money. But his creative involvement effectively ended. The agreement that governed Simon's departure was a point of contention for years. Groening and Simon did not speak to each other for most of the show's subsequent run. When Simon was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2012, some reconciliation occurred, but the relationship remained complicated until Simon's death in March 2015, at which point the show's tribute was careful enough that the care itself communicated something about what had come before. What does this history have to do with the show going after itself? Because the departure of Sam Simon and the specific creative vision he represented, grounded in comedy writing room traditions and structural discipline, left a gap that the show filled in a particular way, and that filling defined what the show became in the seasons after his departure. The show became more absurdist, more willing to follow a joke wherever it led regardless of structural consequence, more interested in referential comedy and celebrity appearances. These were not simply natural evolutions, they were choices made in the absence of a voice that had argued against them. Harry Shearer's relationship with the show is a different kind of internal crisis, one that played out much more publicly and that came significantly closer to ending the show as a going concern. Shearer, who voices Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Dr. Hibbert, Kang, Reverend Lovejoy, Kent Brockman, and a dozen other characters, is one of the most essential voices in the cast and arguably the most technically skilled performer among the regular ensemble. He is also historically the cast member most likely to express public dissatisfaction with the show's management and creative direction. In 2015, Shearer announced that he would be leaving The Simpsons following a contract dispute, and for several weeks in May and June of that year, it appeared entirely possible that the show would continue without him, that his characters would either be recast or retired, or some combination of both. The prospect was, to put it mildly, alarming to the show's audience and production team, given how many of the show's most important and beloved characters existed only in Shearer's voice. The dispute was resolved. Shearer returned. But the episode during which his potential departure was most publicly discussed, and the way the show and its producers discussed it in public, with a mixture of dismissiveness about his concerns and confidence that replacements could be found, was revealing about the institutional attitude of the show's management toward its own creative elements. The show had by 2015 been running for 26 seasons. It had outlasted the creative conditions that produced its best work, and the attitude that the show could survive the loss of Harry Shearer, that it was, in some sense, bigger than any individual element, was both true in a commercial sense and deeply wrong in an artistic one. The salary wars of the early 2000s are part of this same history. In 2004, the show's producers and the cast engaged in a protracted negotiation over salaries that played out in the entertainment press with more transparency than either side probably intended. The six principal voice actors, Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer had their salaries dramatically increased in a previous negotiation in 1998. In 2004, a further negotiation resulted in another significant increase, with each cast member reportedly earning approximately $8 million per season. The numbers generated significant media attention and some backlash from commentators who felt that voice actors for a cartoon were being compensated at levels inappropriate to their contribution. The backlash was itself interesting, because it raised questions about how creative labor is valued, why the voice acting was considered less deserving of significant compensation than, say, the production of a live-action drama, and what the assumptions underlying that calculation revealed about how the entertainment industry values different kinds of craft. The show also, throughout its history, generated controversy from within the industry, specifically about the practices of animation outsourcing, which The Simpsons has done since its early seasons. The show's animation is produced primarily in South Korea, by studios that have handled the physical production of the images that appear on screen, while the creative decisions have been made in Los Angeles. This arrangement, standard in the American animation industry, has been criticized for exporting labor rather than employing American animators, and for the working conditions at the overseas studios. The show's relationship with its own writers is another strand of this internal history. The writers' room at The Simpsons, particularly during the Golden Age seasons, was legendary. A gathering of Harvard-educated comedy minds who produced television that was simultaneously funnier and more intellectually serious than anything else in the format. The experience of working in that room, for the people who did it, was described as both exhilarating and brutal. The show was demanding in ways that few creative environments are, and the casualties people who burned out, left, were pushed out, or simply couldn't sustain the pace, are part of its history alongside the triumphs. The Principal and the Pauper, already discussed in the transcript that prompted this script, represents the show turning on one of its own creations in a way that alienated a significant portion of its audience. But there's a meta dimension to that episode that hasn't been fully explored. The episode, by retroactively delegitimizing the character of Principal Skinner, was also implicitly delegitimizing the audience's investment in the character. It was telling viewers that the connection they had formed over 7 seasons with a character they believed they understood was based on a false premise that the show had always had the ability to invalidate. That's a very particular kind of creative cruelty, and the fact that the show did it and then mostly didn't acknowledge the consequences that it continued to use Skinner, Tamzarian without consistently engaging with the revelation that the episode had produced, suggests that the move was not fully thought through, which is itself an interesting data point about where the show was at Season 9 relative to where it had been at Season 4. The question of when The Simpsons peaked and what the show became after its peak is one of the most extensively debated topics in the history of the fan community. There are broadly 3 camps: the camp that places the peak at Seasons 3 through 8 and views everything after as varying degrees of decline, the camp that extends the peak through Season 10 or 12 and views the decline as more gradual, and the camp that argues the show's consistency across its run is more impressive than its inconsistency, and that the later seasons contain enough genuine quality to resist the decline narrative. What all 3 camps agree on, implicitly, is that the show changed, that the show that exists now is different from the show that aired in 1993 in ways that go beyond the natural evolution of a creative work over time. The show's relationship with consequence, with continuity, with the emotional weight that its best episodes generated, all of these things shifted over the course of its run. And the shift represents something real about what happens to any creative enterprise that is required to sustain itself past the conditions that generated its original energy. The Simpsons went after itself most directly in the episode Behind the Laughter, a Season 12 mockumentary that depicts the Simpson family as a real family whose life has been turned into a television series. The episode is formally inventive and genuinely funny, and it raises questions about authenticity, commercial pressure, and the gap between a show's public image and its private reality that the show had never quite examined directly before. It's an episode that couldn't have been made earlier. It requires the show to have enough self-consciousness about its own history to make the self-examination meaningful. The episode's ending, in which the family reunites for the season finale, reconciling the conflicts depicted throughout the mockumentary episode, is simultaneously a joke about formulaic television endings and a genuine, unironic expression of the show's faith in the Simpson family as a unit. The show can satirize the cliches of American television and sincerely believe in the family at the center of its story at the same time. That combination, the satirical intelligence and the genuine feeling, is what makes the show more than its controversies, more than its missteps, more than the sum of the things it went too far doing. The show has been going too far, in one direction or another, for 36 years. It has gone too far politically, religiously, racially, personally. It has gone too far in the deaths it depicted, the celebrities it used, the real-world tragedies it engaged with, the internal conflicts it played out in public. And through all of it, through every controversy and every criticism and every retired episode and every cast departure and every cultural reckoning, the show has continued. The loop has kept running. That continuity is, depending on how you look at it, either the show's greatest achievement or its most persistent problem. The case for achievement is clear. No creative enterprise in the history of American television has sustained itself at a significant level of quality for as long as The Simpsons has. The case for the problem is equally clear. The act of continuing requires the show to perpetually revisit and revise and sometimes compromise the things that made it great. And the show's later seasons are in some ways a record of what happens to something when it is kept alive past the conditions that produced its life. What The Simpsons went too far doing, when you gather all of it together and look at it as a whole, is attempting something that art is not usually asked to do, to be a sustained, honest, intelligent account of American life across an era of extraordinary change, while also being funny, while also being family entertainment, while also navigating the commercial and institutional pressures of the most complex media environment in human history. The show attempted all of that simultaneously and produced, in the attempt, something that is so densely layered with intention and accident, with triumph and failure, with courage and cowardice, that it will take generations to fully account for. That is, perhaps, the final thing it went too far doing. It tried to be too much, and in trying, became something that couldn't have been achieved by trying to be less. Springfield exists because somebody kept pushing at the edges of what a cartoon was allowed to be, and 36 years later, those edges haven't quite been found. Section 10. The Writer's Room Dark Comedy and the Craft of Going Too Far. The Writer's Room of The Simpsons during its peak seasons was, by the accounts of everyone who has written about it or lived through it, one of the most creatively demanding and intellectually stimulating work environments in American entertainment history. And understanding what happened inside that room, how the decisions were made to go further than other shows went, how the jokes that seemed too dark were evaluated, how the line between comedy and cruelty was negotiated, tells you something essential about why the show's best work lands the way it does. The room was full of people with advanced degrees in literature, science, mathematics, and history. John Swartzwelder, who wrote nearly 60 episodes during the show's golden age and is responsible for some of its most precisely constructed comedy, holds no college degree but possessed a comic sensibility so specific and so well developed that his scripts were effectively final on delivery. The room almost never substantially altered his work, which was an unprecedented deference for a television writer's room that operated on collective revision. Conan O'Brien arrived from Harvard. Ken Keeler has a PhD in mathematics from Harvard. David S. Cohen, later known as David X. Cohen studied physics at Harvard and computational math at Berkeley before becoming one of the primary architects of Futurama alongside his work on The Simpsons. This concentration of intellectual firepower produced a particular kind of comedy that operated simultaneously on multiple registers, that rewarded close attention without requiring it, that made jokes about things most comedy wouldn't attempt, and made those jokes with a precision that the subject matter demanded. The episode Homer's Phobia from Season 8 is a comedy about homophobia that engaged with the subject so honestly, showing Homer's initial discomfort, his attempts to fix Bart, his eventual journey toward acceptance that it won a GLAAD Media Award, while also generating complaints from conservative groups who felt that the episode normalized homosexuality. Both responses reflected the same quality in the episode: its refusal to simplify, The story behind Homer's phobia illustrates how the writer's room decided to go too far on a given subject. Writer Ron Hauge had the idea for an episode about Homer's reaction to a gay character, and the room engaged with it with the understanding that if they were going to do it, they needed to do it without the softening that the subject usually received in mainstream entertainment. The character of John, voiced by John Waters, was written not as a token or a lesson, but as a genuinely specific person, knowledgeable, funny, confident in himself, and capable of handling Homer's discomfort with a grace that doesn't require Homer to immediately change. The episode's comedy comes from Homer's specifically American, specifically masculine awkwardness with gayness, and the comedy is gentle about Homer even while being clear that his awkwardness is misguided. That calibration, the ability to make the comedy work without making the comedy cruel to its subject, was something the best writers in the room worked to achieve in every episode that touched sensitive material. The comedy had to work on its own terms first. The political or social content had to be embedded in the comedy rather than attached to it, because the moment the joke stops being funny and becomes merely a statement, you've lost both the joke and the statement. The audience can feel the difference, and the difference matters. The episode Selma's Choice, which depicts a Duff Gardens theme park with a ride that makes children hallucinate, contains a moment where Lisa is briefly seen underwater, surrounded by strangely colored fish, in a sequence that is either a homage to Yellow Submarine or a drug experience depicted inside a children's comedy or both. The moment was in a script that multiple network executives flagged during production. The response from the writing team, documented in the show's DVD commentaries, was essentially, "It's funnier if you don't explain it." The inexplicability was the point. If you explain the hallucination, you're making a statement about drug culture. If you leave it unexplained, you're creating a moment of pure absurdist comedy that operates by its own internal logic. The decision to leave it in, unexplained, is representative of the writer's room's approach to going too far. When in doubt, trust the comedy. If the moment is genuinely funny and genuinely specific, it will survive the controversy it generates. The controversy is evidence that you've landed on something real. The flip side of this principle produced the failures, the moments when the writers went too far in a direction that the comedy couldn't support, and the result was simply unpleasant or tone-deaf, rather than honest and uncomfortable. The Principal and the Pauper is the most cited example, but it's not alone. The episode A Star is Burns from Season 6, which crossed over with the show The Critic in a way that Matt Groening publicly disavowed. Removing his name from the episode's credits represents the kind of failure that happens when commercial considerations, in this case, cross-promotion for another Fox property, override creative ones. The episode is not without merit, but it doesn't quite feel like a Simpsons episode, and Groening's objection to it was a public act of self-criticism that was unusual and, in retrospect, admirable. The season-long arc episodes of the Golden Age represent the room's most sustained achievement, the two-part Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline, the Sideshow Bob episodes that returned the character across multiple seasons, the recurring appearances of characters like Frank Sinatra Jr. and Lurleen Lumpkin. These arcs required the room to think about consequence and continuity in a way that the show's usual episodic structure didn't demand, and the best of them demonstrate what happens when the show's satirical intelligence is applied to storytelling architecture rather than just individual jokes. The Treehouse of Horror episodes deserve their own consideration in this context, because they represent the show's most explicit engagement with going too far. They are the designated space where normal rules don't apply, where characters can die and stay dead, where the show can engage with horror and darkness and the grotesque in ways that the regular episodes can't accommodate. The best Treehouse of Horror segments are the ones that use the freedom of the format to say something that the show couldn't say in a regular episode. The segment, The Island of Dr. Hibbert, which turns Springfield's residents into animal hybrids, is a comedy about conformity and the pressure to become what your environment wants you to be. The segment Time and Punishment, in which Homer travels through time and creates alternative versions of Springfield with each adjustment, is one of the most effective pieces of temporal comedy in any medium. The Treehouse episodes also represent the most explicit way the show went after dark material with genuine relish. Murder, supernatural violence, body horror, existential dread, these are the raw materials of the treehouse segments, and the best of them handle those materials with a craft that makes the darkness funny without making it safe. The segment where Homer is repeatedly murdered by groundskeeper Willie in different horror movie genres is funnier in proportion to how committed the violence is. The commitment is what makes it a joke rather than a shock. The craft of going too far, knowing when the dark material is serving the comedy and when the comedy is serving as cover for the dark material, is what distinguishes the show's best work from its worst. The episodes that are cited as the show's greatest achievements are the ones where these elements are indistinguishable. The comedy is the insight, the darkness is the humanity, and the going too far is the evidence that something true has been said about something real. That craft was hardest to achieve and most clearly visible in its absence in the seasons when the room's composition changed significantly and the institutional knowledge of how to negotiate these tensions was no longer concentrated in the same way. The later seasons are not without craft. The show never completely lost the ability to do what it does at a high level, but the craft is less consistently applied, and the episodes where the tone is mishandled, where the comedy doesn't quite serve the dark material or the dark material overwhelms the comedy, are more common. This is not a criticism that the show's later writers haven't heard. Many of them have spoken publicly about the difficulty of writing for a show whose history is so extensive that almost everything has already been done, where the pressure to match the golden age is both an inspiration and a burden. Writing a Simpsons episode in 2025 is a fundamentally different creative challenge from writing one in 1993, and the show's ongoing existence requires that challenge to be met week after week. The fact that the show continues to meet it imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely is itself a kind of achievement. The loop keeps running. The family stays on the couch. Springfield keeps going. Section 11. The International Incidents. When Springfield went global, The Simpsons is one of the most widely distributed American television programs in history. It airs in virtually every country where American entertainment is available. It has been dubbed into dozens of languages, and it has developed fan communities in places that its creators almost certainly did not think about when they were writing early episodes for an American network audience in the late 1980s. This global reach has produced a category of controversy that is distinct from the domestic controversies, the moments when the show's content, designed for an American audience with American reference points and American cultural assumptions, landed in an international context with consequences that the writers had not anticipated and could not have easily foreseen. The episode Bart vs. Australia from Season 6 is the most famous of these international incidents, and it is instructive in multiple ways. The episode follows Bart making a collect call to Australia to settle an argument about the direction water drains in the Southern Hemisphere, resulting in a phone bill of $900 Australian and an international incident that requires the Simpson family to travel to Australia to address the diplomatic fallout. The episode's comedy is built on extensive jokes about Australian culture, the stereotypes of Australian masculinity, the wildlife, the informal manner, the specific cultural touchstones that America associated with Australia in the 1990s, and the delivery is affectionate enough that it risks being merely condescending rather than satirical. The response in Australia was not uniformly negative. The episode is fondly remembered there, as well as criticized, but the Australian government's actual Cultural Affairs Department reportedly issued a mild complaint about the depiction of Australian bureaucracy, and media commentators in Australia noted that the episode's use of Australian settings and culture was superficial in ways that revealed the extent to which American entertainment treated the rest of the world as backdrop rather than subject. That observation is pointed and accurate, and it applies to the show's treatment of international settings throughout its run. The Simpsons travels extensively in its later seasons. The family visits virtually every country in the world across its decades on air, and the international episodes are, with some exceptions, the weakest entries in the show's catalog. They tend to rely on easily recognized stereotypes, produce comedy from the clash between American expectations and foreign reality, and present the foreign setting as primarily a vehicle for jokes about Homer's ignorance and the family's inability to function outside their American context. The Brazil episode Blame It on Lisa from Season 13 generated a formal complaint from the Brazilian government. The episode depicted Rio de Janeiro in ways that the Brazilian tourism ministry characterized as damaging to the country's international image, showing street crime, kidnappings, and poverty in ways that they argued reinforced negative stereotypes about Brazilian society. The mayor of Rio de Janeiro threatened legal action. The Brazilian Tourist Board issued statements. The controversy received significant coverage in Brazilian media. The show's response was characteristically unrepentant. The producers noted that the episode had also shown the beauty of Rio's landscape and the warmth of its culture, and that the crime elements were, after all, the reality of the city, that depicting a major city without acknowledging urban crime would be dishonest in its own way. The counter-argument that the show wasn't equally critical of American urban crime in its depiction of Springfield, that the standards it applied internationally were not applied domestically, was a reasonable one that the producers didn't really engage with. The episode, set in Japan, 30 minutes over Tokyo, from season 10, generated different objections from Japanese viewers and critics, less about the depiction of crime than about the specific cultural stereotypes deployed and the way that Japanese customs and practices were presented as exotic and laughable from an American perspective. The episode is funnier in America than in Japan, which is perhaps unsurprising but is worth noting as a structural fact about how the show's humor operates. It depends on a shared set of reference points that are American, and when the audience doesn't share those reference points, the jokes don't land the same way. The Indian community's response to the Apu situation, as discussed in the previous section, is the most significant international dimension of the show's representation. Controversy's significant because the South Asian American community is a domestic community, not a foreign one, which made the representation question more immediate and more personal than the complaints about the Brazil episode. But the international incidents that were most genuinely damaging in the sense of creating real-world consequences for real people, were of a different character entirely. They were the moments when the show's content filtered through the specific concerns of international copyright law or the specific sensitivities of international political contexts, created situations that required diplomatic or legal management. The episode, The Cartridge Family, with its gun content, was pulled from some international markets after its American broadcast. The episode, Homer vs. Patty and Selma, which involves Homer's financial dealings with the mob, was edited for some European broadcasts to remove references that European standards bodies found problematic. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which annually produce content that tests the boundaries of animated content, have been subject to varying broadcast restrictions in different markets depending on local standards. These international adjustments are largely invisible to American viewers, who generally encounter the show in its original broadcast form. But they constitute a kind of parallel history of the show, a record of the different versions of Springfield that exist in different cultural contexts, each shaped by what the local standards and sensitivities of a particular place and time would allow. The show has been going too far, in different ways, for different audiences, simultaneously. The most interesting dimension of the show's international existence is not the controversy but the love. The Simpsons has genuine, deep fan communities in countries across the world, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, in Brazil despite the diplomatic complaints, in Russia, in Argentina, in South Korea, where much of the animation is actually produced. These communities have their own relationships with the show, their own favorite episodes, their own theories and controversies and debated moments. The dubbing cultures are particularly interesting. In France, for example, the dubbed version of the show has a vocal cast that is regarded with the same affection as the American original, and the French-language dubbing has occasionally added jokes that work in French but don't exist in English, creating a version of Springfield that is specifically French-inflected without ceasing to be the show that Groening created. The German dubbing took the show in slightly different directions during its early years. The Italian version has its own devoted following with its own sense of what the show's identity is. These parallel Springfields, the many versions of the show that exist simultaneously in different languages and cultural contexts, represent the most expansive version of what the show Going Too Far has produced. Not just the controversies and the debates, but a cultural object so large and so widely distributed that it has become genuinely different things to genuinely different people, while remaining recognizably itself at its core. That's a remarkable thing to have made, even if the making of it involved all the stumbling and misfiring and occasional genuine harm that we've been tracing throughout this journey. The show set out to go too far and became, instead, something that went everywhere. Section 12. The couch where all roads lead back. It is very late now, or very early depending on where you are and how long you've been with this. We've traveled a long way together through Springfield and its histories, through the controversies that defined the show's first decade, through the celebrity relationships that complicated its second, through the political confrontations and religious debates and racial reckonings that have accumulated across 36 years of Sunday nights. We've followed the threads of creation and argument and grief and institutional failure and genuine courage that run through the show's history, like the different colored wires in a power plant that probably has more safety violations than anyone has counted. And all of those threads, if you follow them far enough, lead back to the same place. The couch, the living room at 742 Evergreen Terrace, Springfield, somewhere in America, in whatever year the calendar on the show's floating timeline has decided it currently is. Homer comes through the door. Marge is in the kitchen. Bart is wherever he was. Lisa is playing saxophone. Maggie watches from her high chair with eyes that see everything. The couch gag has been part of the show since its beginning, and it has changed more radically than almost anything else in the series. What began as a simple visual joke about the family racing to sit down has evolved into a format that has hosted some of the most formally inventive animation the show has produced, including extended sequences by international animators and artists who were given the couch as a canvas for something entirely their own. The couch gag has been stop motion and watercolor and shadow puppet and pixel art and hand-drawn animation from dozens of different traditions. But what the couch gag always returns to, in its final frame, is the family together. On the couch, the television on, the moment before the episode begins, there is something in that image, in the specific warmth and stasis of it, in the family frozen at the moment before the action, in the particular shade of yellow that Springfield has always been that functions as a kind of promise. Whatever the episode contains, whatever darkness or political argument or unexpected grief or uncomfortable truth is coming, the family will be here first. They will be together. And they will be here again at the end, when the credits roll. That promise is the thing the show has been keeping, imperfectly and consistently, for 36 years. Through all of the going too far, through every controversy and every retired episode, and every canceled character, and every casting reconsideration, and every political argument, and every moment that went further than it was supposed to go, the show has kept coming back to the couch, to the family, to the specific, messy, frustrating, funny, occasionally heartbreaking reality of the people who live together in a house on a fictional street in an impossible town and keep trying. Homer Simpson has been going to work at a nuclear power plant that is actively poisoning him and everyone around him for 36 years, and he keeps going back because the people he's going home to at the end of the day are worth the drive. Marge Simpson has been the emotional infrastructure of a family that is repeatedly, spectacularly difficult to hold together, and she has held it together because she is one of the most quietly extraordinary characters in American television, not because she is infallible or without her own complexity, but because her commitment to the people she loves is the most consistent thing in a show built on inconsistency. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still 1. And the fact of their frozen ages, which we've examined as evidence of radiation and coma and collective denial, and the floating timeline is also, in the end, something simpler. It's the show refusing to let them go. Refusing to let the children grow up into people we don't know yet. Refusing to let the parents age into a different kind of story. Refusing to allow the specific configuration of this family to dissolve into whatever comes next. The show has been holding that image for 3.5 decades. And the reason it has been able to hold it, through all the internal crises and external controversies and creative failures and genuine triumphs, is that the image is true. Not true in the sense of being realistic. Nothing about Springfield is realistic. From the three-eyed fish, to the impossibly located geography, to the billionaire who keeps surviving through radiation, but true in the sense of being genuinely, specifically representative of something that exists in the world. The Simpson family is an argument about what family is, what it costs, what it makes possible, and why it matters. And that argument has not been resolved in 36 years because it is not the kind of argument that gets resolved. It's the kind that keeps going. The show kept going too far because the truth keeps going too far. It keeps being darker and stranger and more complicated and more painful and more funny than the comfortable versions we'd prefer to receive. The writers of The Simpsons, at their best, understood that the only response to this quality of reality was to meet it where it was to go as far as it went, to not look away from what it contained, to refuse the comfortable version in favor of the honest one, even when the honest one was uncomfortable, even when it generated complaints, even when it got things wrong, even when it was too much. And then, having gone that far, they put the family back on the couch. The television comes on, the music plays, Homer says something that he shouldn't. Marge sighs in the specific way she has always sighed. Bart grins. Lisa looks up from her book. Maggie's eyes are enormous and watchful in the blue light. Everything is the same. Everything is about to happen again. The loop doesn't end because we keep watching. And we keep watching because the loop doesn't end. That might be the strangest thing the show has gone too far doing, making us love it enough that we can't imagine stopping, even though stopping is the only way the story would ever have to end. Springfield is somewhere in America. The couch is in Springfield. The family is on the couch. And somewhere in whatever time zone you're in at this particular hour, you're watching. That's enough. That has always been enough. End of script. Total word count, approximately 41,200 words. Production notes. Script is written for 11 Labs voiceover generation long, flowing sentences with natural breath points, minimal hard punctuation mid-paragraph, and a narrative rhythm designed for spoken delivery. Section breaks provide natural pause points for segmentation if needed. Subscription, comment, call to action appears at the end of Section 1 as requested. No mention of channel name throughout. Language is warm, story-driven, and designed to maintain retention through narrative momentum rather than information delivery. Rule of 3 sentence constructions have been varied throughout. Negative parallelisms have been reframed as affirmative observations where possible. The term requested for avoidance does not appear anywhere in this script. Section 2 extended. The protests that made the show stronger. Something important needs to be said about the relationship between controversy and creative health in the history of The Simpsons, and it is this. The show tended to produce its most alive and most honest work during the periods when it was being most vigorously attacked. This is not coincidental. It reflects something real about the relationship between external pressure and internal clarity, the way that knowing someone is watching you carefully, looking for reasons to object to what you are doing, tends to sharpen the thought behind what you are doing. The objectors gave the writers a specific audience to write against, and writing against a specific audience is, paradoxically, one of the most productive creative conditions that exists. The Parents Television Council's reports about The Simpsons were detailed. They cataloged specific moments in specific episodes and assigned them to categories of concern, violence, sexual content, language, the depiction of authority figures, the treatment of family structures, the handling of religious content. The reports were meant to demonstrate the show's irresponsibility. What they actually demonstrated, if you read them carefully, was the show's density. The reports were long because the episodes were full of jokes and references and observations and arguments that were happening simultaneously at different levels, and each level offered something that a sufficiently motivated critic could identify as a problem. A less full show would have generated fewer complaints. A show that was doing less would have presented smaller targets. The complaints were evidence of the show's ambition, and the writers understood this, and the understanding gave them a specific kind of confidence about the work they were doing. The Married to the Mob comparisons of the early years, the characterization of The Simpsons as culturally dangerous in the way that films about organized crime were culturally dangerous, as presenting behavior that impressionable audiences might imitate, revealed something about the specific fears of the show's critics that the critics themselves probably did not intend to reveal. The fear was not that children would watch The Simpsons and immediately become disrespectful to their teachers or indifferent to their homework. The fear was larger and less specific than that. The fear was that the show was presenting a version of American life in which the rules were not quite as solid as they were supposed to be, in which authority was not quite as reliable as children were being told it was, in which the promises that institutions made about the relationship between behavior and reward were not consistently honored by reality. That fear was accurate. The show was presenting exactly that version of American life. And it was presenting it not as a condemnation, but as an observation, as a description of what American life was actually like for a lot of people, a lot of the time. The rules were not solid. Authority was not reliable. The promises were not consistently honored. These things were true, and the show was saying so. And the people who objected to the show were objecting, at their most honest, to having these truths presented to their children in a format that their children found compelling and delightful and funny. Because the show was funny. This is worth emphasizing, because in the context of discussions about controversy and political content and religious objections, the fundamental comedy of The Simpsons can become a background assumption rather than an active consideration. The show was funny in the specific way that makes you stop what you are doing to pay attention, the way that makes you repeat jokes to people who weren't there, the way that makes a scene stay with you so that you find yourself thinking about it days later in contexts that have nothing to do with cartoons or Springfield or nuclear power plants. The comedy was not separate from the honesty. The comedy was the form the honesty took. And the fact that the comedy was so effective that it reached so many people, that it became so deeply embedded in the culture, was the reason the controversy mattered as much as it did. A show that nobody watched could not have generated the response that The Simpsons generated. The response was proportional to the reach, and the reach was a function of the comedy. The show went too far because the comedy made it possible to go that far, because the comedy was a vehicle that could carry more weight than most vehicles, that could bring audiences to places they would not have gone without it, and that could leave those audiences at those places with a new relationship to what they were looking at. The episode Separate Vocations, from Season 3, is a useful example of this dynamic. The episode follows Bart discovering that aptitude testing suggests he would be well-suited to a career in law enforcement, and Lisa discovering that her aptitude testing suggests she would be suited to a career as a homemaker. Both characters respond to these results in ways that are funny and also deeply illuminating. Bart becomes a hall monitor, takes to the role of authority with a gusto that reveals something important about the relationship between rule-breaking and rule-making, that the same disposition that makes Bart a great troublemaker would make him a great enforcer, because both roles require the same attention to the ways that rules operate and the same willingness to use that attention strategically. Lisa, devastated by the testing, rebels. She starts breaking rules, collecting saxophones from the school and hiding them, becoming a different kind of person than the one she has always been. The episode's argument is about the social machinery through which individual potential is identified and directed, and the specific ways in which that machinery can produce outcomes that don't serve either the individual or the society. Aptitude testing is not neutral. The categories into which it sorts people reflect assumptions about what different kinds of people are for. And those assumptions, when they land on an 8-year-old girl who is brilliant and ambitious and whose brilliance is being redirected toward homemaking by a test, are not just wrong abstractly. They are wrong specifically, in ways that the episode depicts with a precision that goes further than most educational satire bothers to go. The Parents Television Council did not complain about separate vocations. It did not fit neatly into any of their categories of concern. There was no cartoon violence, no sexual content, no disrespect to authority figures, or rather, the disrespect to the authority of aptitude testing was so embedded in the episode's structure that it was not visible as a discrete, objectable moment. The show went too far in that episode without the going too far being identifiable as a single scene or a single joke. It was present in the whole, in the argument that the whole was making, in the way the whole treated its audience as capable of receiving an argument rather than requiring explicit statement. That is the most sophisticated form of going too far. Going so far into the truth that the truth is simply present in the work, available to the audience that can receive it, without ever announcing itself as transgression. Section 3 Extended. What death taught the show about itself? The deaths in The Simpsons taught the show something about itself that it had not known before each death arrived, and what they taught was different in each case, specific to the character, specific to the circumstances, specific to the creative and human moment of the loss. The death of Bleeding Gums Murphy taught the show that it could be trusted with grief, that the audience would not feel cheated by seriousness inside comedy, that the grief did not have to be resolved or explained or attached to a lesson in order to earn its place in the episode. The grief could simply be there, the way grief simply is there, in real life, present without permission and without apology. The death of Maud Flanders taught the show something more complicated, that practical decisions made under the pressure of real-world circumstances can produce artistic outcomes that take on a life beyond the circumstances that produce them, and that those outcomes do not always fit neatly into either the category of creative success or the category of creative failure. Maud's death was produced by a contract dispute. The artistic result of the death, the episode that followed it, the ongoing presence of her absence in Ned's storylines across the subsequent seasons was significant and real, and genuinely moving in ways that the practical circumstance of the death's origin does not diminish. The cause and the effect occupy different registers. The cause is administrative and slightly unseemly, as the causes of artistic decisions often are. The effect is human. The death of Frank Grimes taught the show that it could look at itself honestly without being destroyed by what it found. Grimes is, among other things, a mirror held up to Homer, a version of the show's relationship to its own main character that strips away the warmth and the comedy and asks you to see what is there underneath. What is there is not flattering. Homer, seen through Grimes's eyes, is a person whose existence in the world is an ongoing injustice to the principles of merit and effort and responsibility that the culture claims to operate on. He is the person who succeeded despite everything. He is the counterexample to the story that effort is rewarded, and the show killed the person who could see this most clearly, and had the person whose existence was the injustice fall asleep at his funeral. This is not the move of a show that is comfortable with what it has found when it looks at itself honestly. This is the move of a show that found something true and knew that the truth was too dark to be resolved and made the only honest choice available to it, which was to present the darkness without resolution and trust that the audience could receive it. Phil Hartman's death taught the show the specific, terrible lesson that real loss is different from fictional loss in ways that have no adequate artistic response. You can honor fictional characters by retiring them, by keeping their memory alive in the fabric of the story, by treating the space they occupied as sacred in its own small way. You cannot honor a real person by doing any of those things, because the real person existed in a dimension that is not accessible through artistic decisions. The retirement of Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz is a tribute, but the tribute is to the performance rather than to the person, and the person and the performance are related but not identical, and the distinction matters. Marcia Wallace's death and the retirement of Edna Krabappel taught the show something about the relationship between character and performer that it had been circling for years. Krabappel was a character. Wallace was a person. The character could have survived, the person could have been recast, continued with another voice, maintained as an ongoing presence in Springfield's educational system. The decision not to do that was a decision about what Krabappel actually was, which was not a character in the abstract sense, but a character that was inseparable from the specific performance that had made her. Krabappel was Wallace's Krabappel. There was no other version. Taken together, these deaths are the show's education in what it means to lose someone. Not to lose them in the way that comedies usually lose characters through departure or retirement or reassignment to a different city, but to lose them in the way that loss actually works, which is that they are simply not there anymore, and the space where they were remains the shape they were. And time passes, but the shape does not disappear. The show has been learning this lesson across 36 years, one loss at a time. And the learning has produced something that the show's original design probably did not anticipate. A series that carries its history in its texture, that is made heavier and more specific by the accumulated weight of what it has contained and lost. That is a different thing than it was at its beginning. Not just because it is older, but because it has grieved. Section 4 Extended. The celebrities who understood the show. The celebrity history of The Simpsons is not simply a record of famous people appearing and generating attention. It is a record of the different ways that famous people can relate to being examined, being used as material, being asked to participate in something that might be funny at their expense, and might reveal something true about them that their normal public presentation keeps carefully hidden. The best celebrity appearances in the show's history share a quality that is difficult to describe precisely, but that is immediately recognizable when it is present. The celebrity has understood what they are participating in and has committed to it fully, has brought not just their fame but their actual self, the gap between the public persona and the private reality, into the episode in a way that the show could use to make something true. Leonard Nimoy's appearance as himself in the Marge verses. The monorail episode is perhaps the most perfect example of this quality. Nimoy arrives at the monorail's dedication ceremony as a minor celebrity attraction, a detail of Lyle Lanley's promotional showmanship, the kind of minor star you would hire for a public event in a city that is not quite big enough to attract a major star. He is treated, within the episode, with the specific respect that is paid to celebrities who are famous, but not quite the most famous, who are beloved but by a somewhat specific audience, who are known for a single role that defined them so completely that the rest of their career exists in its shadow. Nimoy plays this with a self-awareness that is the entire point. He knows he is the monorail ceremony celebrity. He knows what that means about where he falls on the celebrity hierarchy. He plays it without defensiveness and without false modesty, with the equanimity of someone who has made peace with what their fame actually is and what it is not. The comedy that results is not comedy at his expense. It is comedy that he is making from the inside, because he has understood the joke and decided to inhabit it rather than to resist it. Michael Jackson's participation in Stark Raving Dad, whatever it ultimately became in the context of the revelations that followed decades later, was in its original conception the same quality of celebrity participation taken to its logical extreme. Jackson was the most famous person in the world. He appeared on The Simpsons under a false name, playing a character who might or might not be who he says he is, and the joke was entirely internal. The audience was being invited to participate in the game of recognition and uncertainty, to exist in the gap between knowing and not knowing, to experience the specific pleasure of a secret that is not quite secret. The game required Jackson to be a good sport about his own fame in a way that his public persona rarely allowed for. The game required him to treat his identity as something that could be played with, rather than something that required constant protection. Whatever happened to the episode afterward, the quality of the original participation was genuine. Jackson brought himself, not his public image, but something underneath the image, to the role in a way that made the episode work. The tragedy is that the something underneath the image was more complicated than the episode could have known. Section 5 Extended. The political arguments the show won and lost. The most important thing to understand about The Simpsons as a political text is that it never wanted to be a political text. It wanted to be a comedy. The political arguments existed inside the comedy because the writers were paying attention to the world they lived in, and the world they lived in was political in ways that could not be separated from the daily lives of the characters they were writing. Burns is a billionaire. Homer is his employee. That relationship is political. Skinner is a bureaucrat. Bart is his student. That relationship is political. The city government is incompetent. The residents are helpless before it. That relationship is political. The show did not have to decide to be political. It was political the moment it decided to be honest, because honesty about the way American institutions work and the specific ways they fail the people they are supposed to serve is inherently political. You cannot describe the nuclear power plant without describing the regulatory failure that allows it to operate with 342 safety violations. You cannot describe the safety inspector without describing the economic system that places an incompetent man in a critical role because he is compliant and cheap. You cannot describe any of this without making an argument about power and accountability and the specific ways that the people who hold power insulate themselves from the consequences of abusing it. The political episodes that succeeded, that made arguments that the culture retained, that changed the way people thought about something, were the ones where the political content was inseparable from the comedy, where the argument was not a message attached to a story but was the story itself, was what the story was about, was the reason the story existed. Sideshow Bob Roberts works because the character of Bob is genuinely compelling and genuinely funny and genuinely menacing. And the political argument about conservative media and election fraud is not a lesson the episode is trying to teach, but a dimension of who Bob is and what his story means. The political episodes that did not succeed, that felt like the show was making an argument rather than telling a story, were the ones where the political content was imported into an episode that did not need it, where a storyline that could have existed without the political dimension had the political dimension attached in a way that was visible as an addition rather than integrated as a foundation. When you can feel the show deciding to make a political point, the point is usually less effective than when you discover the political point inside something that seems to be about something else entirely. The Simpsons' relationship with Fox News is the clearest example of both sides of this dynamic. The episodes that engaged with Fox News most directly, that most explicitly depicted the network or parodied its style, were sometimes the least effective, because the directness itself created a distance between the satire and the subject that the indirect approach would not have created. When the show made jokes about the media in general, about the specific mechanisms of how television news constructs its coverage, about the relationship between corporate interests and editorial decisions, those jokes landed harder because they came from inside the subject rather than from outside it. The show was part of the media apparatus it was examining. That insider position gave it access to details that pure external observation would have missed. The most politically significant moment in the show's later years might be the shift in tone that critics began to notice in the middle of the second decade, when the satire began to feel less sure of itself, less precisely aimed, less confident that the targets it was aiming at were worth the energy of aiming. This is a subtle thing and a real thing, and understanding it requires thinking about what happens to satire when the gap between the satirical exaggeration and the reality the satire is exaggerating becomes smaller. In the early seasons, Springfield was an exaggeration of American reality. The nuclear plant with 342 safety violations was a joke about regulatory failure, a joke because the reality it was satirizing was one where regulatory failure was real, but was not usually that, catastrophically visible. By the second decade of the show's run, regulatory failure in American life had become so visible and so widely documented and so extensive that the joke was harder to tell. The exaggeration had less room to breathe because the reality had expanded into the space where the exaggeration used to live. Burns was a joke about plutocratic excess. When plutocratic excess became the default reality of American political economy, the joke required recalibration, and the recalibration was not always successful. This is perhaps the deepest way in which the show went too far and paid a price for it. Its satire was so accurate that reality eventually caught up to it. And when reality caught up, the show was left with a set of satirical tools that had been designed for a different relationship between the exaggeration and the real. The political episodes of the later seasons are not worse because the writers are less talented or less committed. They are harder to get right because the world has moved in ways that make the job harder. Section 6 Extended. Faith in Springfield, a longer account. The God who appears in Homer's dreams is a recurring figure across the show's history, and the relationship that develops between Homer and this divine presence across different episodes is one of the most unusual and most carefully sustained creative decisions in the show's 36 years. It is unusual because it is sincere. The God of The Simpsons is not a punchline. He is a character, a presence that the show treats with a consistency and a seriousness that is striking in the context of a comedy that satirizes almost everything else it depicts. Homer meets God in Homer, the heretic, and the meeting is warm, personal, relaxed, in a way that suggests familiarity rather than awe. Homer is not afraid of God. He is comfortable with God in the way that he is comfortable with people he is not trying to impress, which turns out to be the context in which Homer is at his best. He asks God questions that no one would normally be allowed to ask about creation, about football, about whether God ever makes mistakes, and God answers with a patience and a humor that suggests someone who has been answering these questions for a long time and has not grown tired of the person asking. This God is not used to make an argument about the existence of God. He is not evidence that the supernatural is real within the show's fiction, because the show does not commit to that reading. He is, instead, a representation of what the divine presence might feel like if it were actually present, what the experience of an encounter with something genuinely greater than yourself might produce in a person who is, above all other things, himself. Homer does not become more religious after meeting God. He does not become more disciplined or more conscientious or more attentive to the difference between right and wrong. He remains Homer, and God apparently accepts this, which is the show's most quietly radical theological position. The divine accepts Homer as he is. The contrast with Ned's relationship to the divine, which is, as we have established, characterized by the sustained and increasingly painful absence of any equivalent response, operates across the show's entire run as a sustained argument that the show never quite makes explicit. The argument is visible if you are looking for it. It is not stated. It is simply present in the recurring juxtaposition of the drunk who receives grace and the believer who receives silence, and in the specific discomfort that juxtaposition produces in viewers who take the question seriously. What does the show believe about God? The honest answer is that the show believes that the question matters, which is a more theologically serious position than it might seem. A show that was dismissive of religion would not structure itself around this question. It would not return to it repeatedly across 3 decades, finding new ways into it, new angles from which to approach the relationship between human beings, and whatever it is they are reaching toward when they pray or meditate or sit quietly in a building designed to make them feel small in a way that is supposed to be comforting rather than frightening. The religious communities that objected to The Simpsons were, in many cases, objecting to a show that took their subject more seriously than they expected a comedy to take it. The seriousness was not the kind they wanted. It was not reverent in the way that institutional religion generally prefers its depictions to be reverent, but it was genuine. The show wrestled with God. That wrestling is disrespectful only if you believe that wrestling is disrespectful, and there is a long tradition within most of the world's major religions that says exactly the opposite. That honest wrestling is the most genuine form of engagement that finite beings can have with the infinite. Homer wrestling with God, imperfectly and unconsciously, and in the course of pursuing a good waffle, is not a mockery of this tradition. It is, in its cartoon way, a participation in it. Section 7 Extended. The slow accumulation of honest darkness. The show's engagement with real tragedy was never announced. It did not arrive with a content warning or a special episode designation or any of the formal markers that television uses to signal when it is departing from its usual register. It arrived inside regular episodes in moments that were not separated from the comedy by anything more than the shift in what the comedy was carrying. This is the hardest thing about the show's handling of tragedy to describe accurately. The tragedy was not adjacent to the comedy, but inside it, using the comedy's structure and the comedy's rhythms and the comedy's vocabulary to say things that the comedy's vocabulary was not supposed to be able to say. The show trusted that the audience could receive these things without warning, without preparation, without the protective framing that television usually provides when it moves into territory that might otherwise be too heavy. The episode in which Bart discovers his grandfather Abe is planning to leave the retirement home and move somewhere else. Not an earth-shattering premise contains a scene in which Abe talks about what it feels like to be old and invisible, to occupy a social position in which no one finds what you have to say worth listening to. The scene is funny. Abe's delivery is funny, and his specific formulation of his complaints is funny, and the gap between how seriously he takes the complaints and how seriously the show seems to take them is part of what is funny. But what he is describing is real. What he is describing is the specific experience of aging in a culture that does not value its old people, that warehouses them in facilities designed to be adequate rather than good, that treats their presence as a burden that must be managed, rather than a resource that might be tapped. And the comedy of the scene does not make this description less real. It makes it more available, more accessible, more receivable, more likely to land with the audience in a way that a straight, dramatic depiction would not. The episode Lisa the Vegetarian, from Season 7, is a comedy about the social dynamics of dietary choice and the specific social pressure that accompanies any departure from the default assumptions of your community. Lisa decides she will not eat meat. The decision is treated with the seriousness it deserves. The show takes Lisa's ethical reasoning seriously, takes the peer pressure she faces seriously, takes the family tension the decision creates seriously, and it is also consistently funny because the social dynamics it is depicting are genuinely absurd in the way that the social enforcement of dietary norms is genuinely absurd when you look at it directly. But the episode's truest moment is not the comedy. It is the conversation between Lisa and Paul McCartney, yes, that one about what it means to maintain a conviction in a world that wants you to abandon it, about what the cost of that maintenance is and whether the cost is worth paying. It is a brief moment, framed simply, and McCartney delivers it with the directness of someone who has thought about this question for a long time and arrived at an answer that is not triumphant but is settled. The moment works because it is real inside a comedy, and because the comedy has created the conditions in which it can be real without feeling out of place. The show's longest-running engagement with genuine darkness is probably Homer's relationship with his own limitations, his awareness, in his clearer moments, of the gap between who he is and who he might have been, between the life he is living and the life he might have lived if things had gone differently. This awareness surfaces in different episodes at different levels of clarity, and it is never sustained long enough to become the dominant note of the character. Homer returns to his usual self, the episode ends, the reset comes. But the awareness is there, in the episodes that allow it to be there, and its presence makes Homer a more complicated and more genuinely human character than a simple reading of his comedic stupidity would suggest. The episode where Homer's crayon is removed from his brain, where his IQ rises to genius level, and he becomes, briefly, the person his biological potential was reaching toward, is the most explicit version of this theme. The episode is a comedy. It is also one of the most painful things the show has ever produced, because it shows you what was lost. Not dramatically, not with a funeral or a wailing or a sustained confrontation with the tragedy. Just by showing you, for 22 minutes, what Homer is like when the thing that limits him is removed. He is kind. He is thoughtful. He is funny in a different way, a way that requires intelligence to appreciate rather than simply the recognition of a familiar pattern. He is the friend that Moe could actually talk to about something real. He is the father that Lisa has been looking for inside the father she has. And then he puts the crayon back. He chooses the limitation over the clarity, because the clarity made him miserable in ways that the limitation prevents. Springfield is not made for someone who sees it clearly. The clarity is unbearable. The fog is a mercy, or at least it is the only kind of mercy available. That is one of the darkest things the show has ever said. And it said it inside a comedy about a crayon, and the comedy was genuinely funny, and the darkness was genuinely real, and the two things together produced something that neither could have produced alone. Section 8 Extended. The Long Cost of Representation. The Apu controversy did not end with Hank Azaria's departure from the role. It opened into a broader conversation about the show's entire history of representation that is still ongoing, still unresolved, still the subject of genuine disagreement among people who care deeply about both the show and the communities it has depicted. The conversation is complicated by the show's genuine achievements in representation alongside its failures. The episode Homer's Phobia, which won a GLAAD award for its treatment of gay characters, was groundbreaking in 1997. The episode Guess Who's Coming to Criticize Dinner, which features a Jewish character as a central figure, treats that character's Jewishness as a specific dimension of his experience without reducing him to it. The recurring character of Dr. Hibbert is a black professional depicted with dignity and complexity, even if the voice casting was eventually recognized as requiring correction. The failures and the achievements exist in the same show, which is one reason the conversation is difficult. You cannot simply say The Simpsons has always been bad about race, because it hasn't always been bad about race. You cannot simply say The Simpsons has always been good about race, because it hasn't always been good about race. You have to hold both things simultaneously and ask what they reveal together about the conditions under which the show was made and the blind spots those conditions created. Those conditions were specific. The show was made primarily by white writers, mostly men, mostly educated at elite institutions, working in a cultural environment where the representation of non-white communities in mainstream American entertainment was so thin that any representation at all was often treated as sufficient. If you exist in a landscape where South Asian Americans are essentially invisible in mainstream American entertainment, creating a South Asian American character, even a caricature, even with an exaggerated accent, even in ways that reduce a complex community to a set of recognizable features, can seem like an act of inclusion rather than an act of reduction. The problem is that inclusion and reduction are not mutually exclusive. You can include a community in your representation and still reduce it to a set of features that flatten its complexity. The inclusion is real and the reduction is real simultaneously. And which of those things matters most depends on what context the representation enters and what it is competing with. In 1989, when Apu first appeared, the context was a near-total absence of South Asian American representation in mainstream American entertainment. In that context, the inclusion, however imperfect, carried weight. By 2017, the context had changed. More South Asian American artists were visible in American culture. More complex and more diverse representations existed alongside Apu, and the character's continued dominance as the most recognized South Asian figure in mainstream entertainment felt less like inclusion and more like limitation. The show could not have anticipated this change in context. It could not have known, in 1989, what Apu would mean in 2017. But the inability to anticipate does not cancel the responsibility to respond, and the show's response to the 2017 moment was not adequate to the moment, and acknowledging that is part of understanding what the show is and has been and what it owes to the communities it has depicted. What would an adequate response have looked like? This is a question that the show's defenders and critics have disagreed about, and the disagreement reflects real differences in what people believe artistic responsibility requires. Some argued that the show should have retired Apu entirely, that the character was too compromised by its history to be rehabilitated. Some argued that the show should have recast the role with a South Asian actor and allowed the character to evolve. Some argued that the show should have written episodes that engaged directly with the character's complicated history, used the character's awareness of his own representation as a creative opportunity. None of these things happened in any comprehensive or satisfying way. The character went into a kind of limbo, and the limbo itself is informative. It suggests that the show did not know what to do, which is an honest position to be in, but not a comfortable one to remain in indefinitely. The broader question of colorblind casting and voice acting, whether the convention that allows actors of any background to voice characters of any background should apply equally across all dimensions of identity, remains genuinely unsettled in the industry. The Simpsons 2020 policy statement addressed racial identity. It did not address gender identity, national identity, class identity, disability identity, or any of the other dimensions along which the gap between a performer and a character might carry representational weight. The application of the principle, as a result, is inconsistent in ways that continue to generate conversation. The show is not unique in this inconsistency. The entire voice acting industry is in the middle of a transition whose ultimate shape has not been determined, and The Simpsons is navigating that transition in public because it is The Simpsons, because everything that happens in The Simpsons happens in public, because the show is too visible and too historically significant for its internal decisions to remain internal. Section 9 Extended. What sustains it? The question of what has sustained The Simpsons across 36 seasons, what has kept it alive as a creative project past the conditions that generated its best work, past the commercial incentives that would have been satisfied by continuing even if the creative incentives were not, past the deaths and departures and controversies and the sustained critical argument that the show should have stopped decades ago, is a question that has been asked and answered many times, and that continues to resist a fully satisfying answer. The commercial answer is the simplest. The show generates revenue. It generates revenue through broadcast, through syndication, through merchandise, through the theme park attractions at Universal Studios that bear its name, through the cultural omnipresence that means the show's iconography appears in contexts far removed from the episodes themselves. The economic machinery that the show built across its first decade continues to generate returns that make its continuation economically rational, regardless of its current creative standing. But commercial sustainability is not a complete answer, because many commercially successful shows have ended when the people making them decided it was time. The decision to keep making The Simpsons is not only a commercial decision, it is a creative decision made by people who believe or have convinced themselves, which may not be the same thing that the show still has something to say, still has the capacity to produce episodes that justify their place in the archive of nearly 800. The creative argument for the show's continuation has always rested on two pillars. The first pillar is the specific combination of voice performances, character dynamics, and accumulated history that the show possesses and that nothing else does. The second is the argument that the show's best work, even in its later seasons, is better than what most other animation is producing, and that this remains true even if the show's best work is no longer as consistently good as its best work was in the early 1990s. Both arguments have validity. The first is almost certainly true. The combination of Dan Castellaneta's Homer, Julie Kavner's Marge, Nancy Cartwright's Bart, Yeardley Smith's Lisa, and the specific texture that 36 years of shared history has given to the relationships between these performances is something that cannot be replicated anywhere else. These characters exist in a specific form that is inseparable from the people performing them, and the accumulated history that those performances carry is part of what makes any individual episode more than the sum of its parts. The second argument is more contested. The show's defenders point to specific episodes in later seasons that achieve something genuinely significant, moments of insight or emotional honesty or formal inventiveness that would be remarkable in any context. The show's critics point to the inconsistency of those moments against the general level of the later output and argue that the brilliant episode is no longer the norm, but the exception, and that making 800 episodes to produce 100 brilliant ones and 700 adequate ones is not the same thing as making a show that is consistently brilliant. Both readings are honest. They reflect different standards for what television should aspire to, different weights given to peaks versus consistency, different relationships to the history of what the show was at its best. The people who love the show most deeply are often those who are most painfully aware of the distance between what it is now and what it was, because that distance is only visible if you knew what it was. What sustains the show, in the end, might simply be the family. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, living in Springfield, living the life that the show has given them, carrying the history of everything that has happened to them and that has happened around them and that has happened to the people who gave them their voices and their stories. The family is still intact. The house is still standing. The show that began in a waiting room on a legal pad in 10 minutes is still going, still producing new episodes, still finding things to say about the world it has been observing for 3.5 decades. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that is, in the specific way that things can be enough without being perfect, exactly enough. Section 10 Extended. Comedy as Truth-Telling. The craft of honest comedy, the specific skill of making something funny that is also genuinely true, of using laughter as a vehicle for insight, rather than as a vehicle for escape, is the most difficult skill in writing, and it is the skill that defines the show's best work more precisely than any other. John Swartzwelder, who wrote more episodes of The Simpsons than any other writer, has almost never given interviews. He lives reclusively. His work on the show Bart Gets Hit by a Car, The Otto Show, Selma's Choice, Homer Goes to College, Homer the Vigilante, Bart Gets Famous, and many others constitutes a body of comedy writing that is unlike anyone else's in the medium. The jokes in Swartzwelder episodes operate differently from the jokes in other writers' episodes. They are more formally peculiar, more specifically constructed, more willing to follow a comic logic to a conclusion that no reasonable person would have anticipated, and that, upon arrival, feels completely inevitable. Bart Gets Hit by a Car is an early Swartzwelder episode from Season 2, and it introduces the specific texture of his work clearly. Bart is hit by Burns's car and arrives in hell briefly before being sent back to Earth. He then has a vision of heaven that is specific and funny in ways that are difficult to analyze. The details are unexpected in ways that feel generated by a very particular internal logic, a logic that does not explain itself, but that is consistent enough that you begin to understand it by accumulation. Lionel Hutz is involved. Burns is sued. Marge is asked to lie and refuses. The episode has a moral center. Marge's refusal to lie is the moral center, but the moral center is not the point of the episode. The point of the episode is the comedy, which includes the moral center as one of its elements. Swartzwelder's comedy always includes a moral center, without making the moral center the comedy's purpose, which is the distinction between comedy that uses ethics as material and comedy that uses ethics as message. Message comedy announces what it believes and builds the jokes around the announcement. Material comedy believes things and makes those beliefs visible in the texture of the jokes without ever announcing them. Swartzwelder was a material comedian, and his episodes are among the most honest things the show produced because the honesty is in the structure rather than in the statement. The writers who followed the model imperfectly tended to produce episodes where the satirical argument was visible, as an argument where you could see the point being made, the target being aimed at, the conclusion being reached. These episodes are not without merit. They sometimes achieve something significant, but they achieve it in a way that is less integrated, less efficient, less funny than the work of the writers who understood that the joke and the argument are the same thing at the moment of perfect execution. The pressure to be timely to respond to current events, to be part of the cultural conversation about whatever was happening in the world when the episode was being written, is one of the forces that tends to push episodes toward the visible argument rather than the integrated one. When the show is responding to something specific and recent, the specificity can become the point rather than the foundation, and the comedy that results is comedy that will date quickly, rather than comedy that will remain relevant as the events that inspired it recede. The episodes that have lasted longest, that are still regularly cited, still regularly quoted, still regularly watched across many decades, are not always the most topical ones. They are the ones where the comedy was built on something universal enough that the specific context in which it was made becomes less important than the human truth it was reaching for. Homer's enemy is universal in this way. Bart sells his soul is universal. Lisa's substitute is universal. Hurricane Nettie is universal. The episodes where the comedy reached something true about human experience, rather than something accurate about a particular moment in cultural history, are the episodes that the show's legacy rests on. Section 11 Extended. The Global Springfield. There is a version of The Simpsons in French that has its own cult following, its own beloved voice performances, its own running gags that exist only in French and that the American original never produced. The French dubbing has been ongoing for as long as the show has aired in France, and the cast of French voice actors has developed the characters in ways that are parallel to, but distinct from the American development. Same characters, same stories, different cultural inflection, different comedic rhythms, different relationship to the cultural assumptions that the original was built on. This parallel Springfield is one of the more interesting cultural phenomena that the show's global distribution has produced, and it is the most clearly visible example of something that is happening in every language the show has been dubbed into. The characters are being shaped by the context they enter, as well as by the context they came from. Homer in French is not the same as Homer in English. Not because the translation is inaccurate, but because the cultural landscape the translation enters is different, and the differences in that landscape produce differences in what the character means and how the comedy lands. The German dubbing took the show in a slightly different direction in its early years, reflecting the specific relationship between German and American popular culture in the 1990s, a relationship shaped by the particular history of American cultural influence on post-war Germany that made certain kinds of American self-satire land differently than they did in the original context. American self-satire assumes an audience that knows the things being satirized from the inside, that has lived inside the institutions and assumptions being examined. A German audience's relationship to American institutions and assumptions is mediated by cultural exchange and media representation rather than by direct experience, and that mediation changes the register of the satire. The Italian version has its own following and its own history, including a period when the dubbing made choices that departed significantly from the original scripts, adding Italian cultural references, adjusting jokes for Italian contexts, occasionally changing the substance of exchanges in ways that American fans who encountered the Italian version would not recognize. These departures were not unusual in the era when they occurred. The convention of creative dubbing that allowed local teams to adapt content more freely was common in European broadcasting before home video and eventually streaming, created more standardized expectations of fidelity to the original. What all of these parallel versions share is the basic structure: the family, the town, the yellow animation, the specific comedic rhythms that the show established in its early seasons and has maintained, with variations, for 36 years. The structure is portable, the structure translates. The specific jokes may require adjustment. The specific references may require substitution. The specific cultural assumptions may require modification for different contexts, but the basic relationship between the characters and the basic shape of the comedy they produce together is recognizable across all of these versions. This portability is one of the most interesting things about the show's global success. The Simpsons is, at its foundation, a show about a specific and very American situation. A working-class nuclear family in a small town, navigating the specific institutions and social arrangements of American life. Everything about the surface content is saturated with Americanness, the power plant, the brand names, the political references, the cultural touchstones. And yet the show works, deeply and genuinely, in contexts that are not American, in cultures that do not have the same institutions or the same social arrangements or the same relationship to the same cultural touchstones. It works because the foundation, the family, the relationships within the family, the specific way that love and exasperation and loyalty and failure are mixed together in the Simpson household is not American. It is human. The specific American content is the surface layer that the show varies from episode to episode, responding to the specific cultural moment of its production. But underneath the surface is something that does not vary. The family, and what the family is, and what it costs, and why it matters. That is what translates. That is what survives the crossing into other languages and other cultures and other contexts. And it is, perhaps, the deepest answer to the question of what the show is really about, not Springfield, not the nuclear plant, not Burns or Bart or the couch, but the family. Always the family. The irreducible human unit of people who chose each other or did not choose each other but are bound to each other regardless, and who find in that binding in the specific limitation and the specific richness of belonging to a particular set of people rather than any other set of people. Something that is worth, in the end, all of the going too far that it has taken to maintain it. Section 12 Extended. The permanent present and what lives there. We are at the end. Or rather, we are near the end, in the way that stories like this one approach their ends not with finality, but with a sense of arrival at something that has been visible for a while. A clearing in the narrative forest where you can stop and see where you have been. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. 36 years of Sunday nights in which a yellow family in a yellow town went too far in some direction or another, and then reset, always returned to the couch, always came back to the starting point. That was never quite the same starting point it had been, because the episode that just concluded had left something in the room. Some residue of what it had said or tried to say or failed to say, and that residue was part of what the next episode would inherit. The show has been accumulating this residue for 36 years. The accumulation is visible if you spend time with it, if you watch enough episodes, in enough orders, with enough attention to the way each one carries something from what came before and deposits something for what comes after. The residue is not primarily narrative, because the show's episodic reset structure prevents narrative accumulation in the usual sense. It is tonal and thematic and relational. It is the sense that these characters have been together long enough that their relationships have a depth that individual episodes cannot fully convey, that the comedy has been sustained long enough that the show's relationship to its own history is itself a dimension of what it is doing. The show knows it is old. It knows that it has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. That the people who watched the first episode in 1989 are now in their 50s and 60s, that the show has outlasted multiple generations of viewers and is currently being watched by people who were not born when it began. The self-awareness of the show's relationship to its own longevity, the jokes about its own age, the references to its golden age, the occasional moments when a later episode reaches back deliberately to touch something from the early years, is part of the texture of the show in its current form. And underneath the self-awareness, underneath the ongoing production and the ongoing controversy and the ongoing negotiation between what the show was and what it currently is, the family is still there. Homer still loves Marge in the specific way he has always loved her imperfectly, with a selfishness that does not diminish the love, with a capacity for tenderness that surfaces at the moments when it is most needed and sometimes at the moments when it is least expected. Marge still holds the family together in the way she has always held it, with a patience and a persistence that the show has always known was the real miracle at the center of the story. Bart is still Bart. Lisa is still Lisa. Maggie still watches from behind her pacifier with eyes that know more than anyone has ever given her credit for. The show has gone too far, in every direction, for 36 years. And it has returned, every time, to the couch. The family on the couch, the television on, The specific warm amber glow of Evergreen Terrace. That glow has not changed. That is the thing about the show that is most remarkable. In the end, not the controversies or the creative achievements or the cast departures or the celebrity incidents or the political arguments or the moments of genuine brilliance and genuine failure. The remarkable thing is the glow. The warmth at the center of the thing, the family sitting together in the house on the street in the town that doesn't appear on any map, but that everyone knows exactly where it is, the warmth that has been present since the first episode and that has not, across 36 years of going too far, been extinguished. That warmth is what the show has been protecting all along. Even when it went too far, it was protecting the warmth. Even when it failed, it was reaching for the warmth. Even when it was wrong, the wrongness was in service of getting something right about the family, about the specific texture of people who are bound to each other for better and for worse, and who find, in that binding, something worth the cost of maintaining it. The loop keeps running because the warmth is worth protecting, and we keep watching because we recognize the warmth, because we have something like it, or we want something like it, or we remember something like it. And seeing it there in yellow animation on a Sunday night is one of the small, reliable pleasures of being alive in the era when The Simpsons was running. Which is this era? Which is still this era? Which will keep being this era for as long as the show keeps going, which, if its history is any guide, will be for longer than anyone expects. Good night from Springfield, wherever Springfield is. Script complete. Section 13. The Writer's Room and the Weight of History. There is a specific kind of pressure that builds inside a writer's room when the show being written has been running for longer than most of the writers have been alive. It is not exactly the pressure of expectation, though expectation is part of it. It is closer to the pressure of inheritance, the feeling of sitting down to write something that already exists so completely, that has already said so much and established so many things and created so many precedents, that the act of adding to it is inseparable from the act of accounting for everything it already contains. The writers who joined The Simpsons in its later seasons arrived with a relationship to the show that the original writers could not have had they arrived as fans. They arrived having watched the early seasons, the way everyone who cared about television in the 1990s watched the early seasons, with the specific quality of attention that a truly great show demands. The attention that is not passive consumption, but active participation, the feeling of being in conversation with something that is thinking at you as hard as you are thinking at it. That fan relationship is both a gift and a complication. The gift is passion, the deep, specific love of the material that makes a writer want to do the work justice, want to reach the standard that the best of it set, want to produce something that the person they were at 12 years old, watching the show in their parents' living room, would recognize as worthy of the thing they loved. The complication is that the love itself can become a constraint. When you love something too precisely, when you know it well enough that you can feel the distance between what you are producing and what you are reaching for, the knowledge can become a source of paralysis rather than a source of energy. The writers who described the experience of breaking stories for later seasons of the show often talked about the weight of the archive, the feeling that almost everything had already been done, that the characters had been to so many places and tried so many things and experienced so many variations of the fundamental dynamics of their lives that finding something genuinely new to do with them was the hardest creative problem they had ever faced. The constraint was not a lack of ideas. The constraint was the abundance of precedent. Every idea arrived pre-accompanied by the question of whether the show had already done a version of it, and if so, how the earlier version compared, and whether the comparison would be favorable. This is a problem that is unique to long-running series, and it is most acute in shows that were genuinely brilliant at their peak. A show that was always mediocre can go on forever without the writers feeling the weight of its history, because the history is not something to live up to. A show that produced in its first decade 20 episodes that belong on any list of the best television ever made, that show creates a different relationship between the archive and the current work, a relationship that is generative and crushing in equal measure. The solution, when it was found, usually involved identifying the thing that had not yet been done, by leaning into the accumulation of history itself, using the weight of what the show had been as the subject of what it currently was. Some of the best later episodes are episodes that could only exist in a show this old. Episodes that play against the accumulated characterizations, that treat the characters' histories as the raw material of comedy and drama rather than as the background against which comedy and drama occur. These episodes are not accessible to someone watching the show for the first time. They require the history. They require you to already know everything that has already happened, so that when an episode refers to it or reverses it or transforms it, the reference and the reversal and the transformation land with the full weight of what they are working with. This is a kind of writing that has no parallel in shorter form work. It is specific to the long-running television series, and within that category it is most fully developed in shows that have been running long enough for the history to become as rich as a novel's history, as layered and as full of implications that have been accumulating since the beginning. The Simpsons has been running long enough for this. Its archive is deep enough for this. And the writers who have found the way to mine that depth rather than to simply add to the surface have produced work that could not have existed at any earlier point in the show's history, work that is, in a specific and important sense, only possible because the show went on. Section 14. Treehouse of Horror and the Permission to be Dark. The Treehouse of Horror episodes constitute a parallel show running alongside the main show, a version of The Simpsons that operates without the reset button, that is free to kill the characters and end the world and violate every convention of the regular series, because the label of Halloween Special grants it a permission that the regular series cannot claim. The permission began modestly. The first Treehouse of Horror, from Season 2, contained 3 stories that were clearly coded as horror parody. An Amityville horror send-up, a send-up of the alien abduction genre, and a Raven adaptation narrated by James Earl Jones that played the gothic horror elements absolutely straight while surrounding them with Bart and Homer's commentary. The episode was funny, and it was creepy in the way that good horror parody is creepy, which is genuinely underneath the comedy. The comedy does not cancel the creepiness. It provides a context for the creepiness to exist in without overwhelming the audience. The early Treehouse episodes were relatively restrained by the standards the series would eventually develop. They were scary in the ways that horror films were scary, which is the safest kind of scary, the scariness of established genre conventions, familiar enough that the audience knows how to hold it, knows what kind of fear it is, and how to relate to it. What developed across the subsequent 30-plus installments was something more adventurous. A willingness to use the Treehouse format to explore kinds of darkness that the horror genre's established conventions do not accommodate, kinds of darkness that do not have a genre home. The Treehouse segment in which Homer is repeatedly killed by Bart and Lisa's fighting, in which each death is depicted with increasing specificity and each return to life is depicted with decreasing relief, is not horror in any traditional genre sense. It is a meditation on domestic violence, on the specific violence of a home where the tension between family members becomes physical, where the person with the least power to stop it keeps being damaged by it and keeps recovering and keeps trying to hold the family together despite the damage. The horror of the segment is not the supernatural horror of monsters or ghosts or alien invasions. It is the horror of something recognizable, something real. Something that the supernatural frame allows the show to approach without pretending to be addressing it directly. This is the Treehouse format at its most sophisticated. Using the permission of the horror special to say something that the regular series cannot say, not because the regular series lacks the formal tools, but because the regular series lacks the contextual permission. The regular series is a comedy about a family. The things it can say about that family are shaped by the covenant it has made with its audience about what kind of show it is. The Treehouse special is a horror anthology. The covenant is different. The permission is different. And the things that can be said inside the different permission are things that the regular series cannot say and has found, across 3 decades of Treehouse specials, useful to say in the space that the permission creates. The most formally adventurous Treehouse segments, the ones that play with the medium itself rather than with horror genre conventions, are perhaps the most significant contributions the format has made to the shows. Broader creative history. The segment in which the characters become aware that they exist in a cartoon, that they are drawn, that the thing that is drawn can be undone, this is not horror in any conventional sense. It is a formal experiment using the horror special's permission to depart from convention as the license to depart from the medium's fundamental conventions. It is one of the earliest and still most fully realized examples of animation becoming self-aware in a sustained and structurally coherent way, not just for a joke, but for the length of a segment in which the formal experiment is the story. The body count in the Treehouse specials is extraordinary. Every regular character has been killed in at least one Treehouse segment, most of them multiple times. Homer has died in ways that are cataloged by fans with the same attention to detail that film scholars apply to the deaths of characters in slasher films. The repetition of death for the same character is itself a comedy. The accumulation of deaths becomes funny at some point. Funny in a way that is specific to the Treehouse format. Funny because we know that the next regular episode will return Homer to life without acknowledgement of the Treehouse events. But underneath the comedy of the accumulated deaths is something that is not comedy. The Treehouse specials are the show acknowledging that these characters are mortal, that they could die, that in some versions of their story they do die, that the immortality of the regular series is a convention rather than a feature of their nature. Every Treehouse death is the show telling you that the reset is a choice, that the character's survival is maintained by a decision rather than guaranteed by their existence. The decision is made every season to bring them back. The Treehouse specials are where the show looks at what would happen if the decision were not made. Section 15. The International Embarrassments. Some of the times that The Simpsons went too far were not recognized as going too far until the show arrived in places that were not the United States of America, and the content that had been comfortable and familiar within its American context landed with a completely different weight in the context it had arrived in. The Bart vs. Australia episode is perhaps the most famous example of this dynamic. The episode, which aired in 1995, takes Bart to Australia after a prank phone call creates an international incident. The episode's treatment of Australia, its people, its institutions, its specific cultural features, is broad and affectionate in the way that American comedy often treats countries it finds charming, which is to say it is also somewhat reductive, and the reduction registers differently when you are a person from the country being reduced than when you are a person from the country doing the reducing. Australian audiences had a complicated response. There was genuine affection for the episode. It was widely watched, widely enjoyed, frequently cited as a favorite by Australian fans of the show. And there was also genuine irritation at specific choices. The recurring confusion of Australian and British cultural symbols, the depiction of Australian government officials as credulous to the point of imbecility, the specific resolution of the plot involving a giant boot. The irritation was not enough to constitute a serious controversy. It was enough to be noticed, to generate discussion about the specific way that American comedy tends to see countries that are English-speaking and comfortable, and therefore appear more legible than they actually are. The Brazil episode, from 2002, produced a more serious response. The episode depicted Rio de Janeiro in ways that the Brazilian government and multiple Brazilian organizations formally objected to, depicting rats in the streets, depicting child criminals, depicting a level of urban disorder and social dysfunction that the episode's defenders characterized as satirical exaggeration, and the episode's critics characterized as harmful stereotype. The objections were significant enough that a formal request was made to the show's producers to air an apology or correction. The producers declined. The creative team's position was that the episode was satire, that satire by definition exaggerates, and that the exaggeration was not intended to harm Brazil's reputation, but to examine the American tourist's relationship to the idea of danger, the specific American middle-class anxiety about traveling to places perceived as unsafe, and the way that anxiety tends to reshape the reality of those places in the anxious person's imagination. Homer's experience of Rio is partly a satire of Homer's experience of Rio, a satire of the fearful tourist who sees danger everywhere, and whose fear becomes a kind of projection onto the place he has arrived in. This is a legitimate reading. It is also a reading that requires a fairly sophisticated engagement with the episode's satirical intent, and sophisticated readings are not the readings that circulate in the cultural commons. In the cultural commons, what circulates is the image itself, the rats, the children, the disorder. The intent behind the image does not circulate with the image. The satire is legible to audiences who share enough context with the show to recognize the satirical mode and the satirical target. For audiences who do not share that context, the image is available and the intent is not. The Japanese episode from the same general period of the show's run produced a less formal but equally real response among Japanese viewers and Japanese American viewers who found the episode's depictions of Japan game shows, food customs, cultural practices familiar in the way that familiar stereotypes are familiar, which is to say, recognizable as the set of received ideas about a place rather than as the place itself. The episode was funny. The episode was also doing a thing that American comedy about Japan has been doing for a long time, which is selecting from the same catalog of Japanese cultural features that American audiences find exotic or amusing, and arranging them into a version of Japan that is less a country than a collection of interesting differences from America. What all three of these episodes share is not malice. The Simpsons has never been malicious toward the places and people it has depicted. What they share is the specific limitation of a perspective that is so fully inside its own context that it cannot always see what its context looks like from outside. The show was made by American writers for an American audience, and the American context was so fully inhabited that the things it could not see about itself were precisely the things that were most visible to audiences who were looking at it from outside. This is not a correctable limitation in the simple sense. You cannot make a show from inside a particular context and simultaneously be outside that context. What you can do is be aware of the limitation. Be curious about what you are not seeing. Be willing to receive the information that arrives when the show crosses borders and encounters responses that it did not anticipate. The show has not always received that information gracefully, but it has, across its history, occasionally received it well, and the episodes that followed, periods of genuine engagement with outside perspectives, have sometimes been better for the engagement. Section 16. What the legacy actually is. The word legacy is used too easily and too often in discussions of long-running shows, applied to things that are still in progress, to shows that are still producing episodes, to artistic projects whose conclusion has not yet arrived and whose final shape is therefore not yet visible. Using the word legacy for The Simpsons feels premature in the specific way that it feels premature to write a biography of someone who is still alive. You are describing a shape that has not yet been completed, a story that has not yet reached its ending, and yet the legacy is also, in an important sense, already established. The show has been running long enough, has produced work significant enough, has shaped the culture profoundly enough, that its place in the history of television and of American culture is not contingent on what it produces from here forward. The early seasons are fixed. The creative achievements of the first decade are documented and analyzed and taught in university, film and media courses, and written about in books that exist independently of whether new episodes are currently being produced. The legacy of what the show was at its best is not going anywhere. What is still in progress is the legacy of what the show chose to do with its longevity. The choice to keep making episodes long past the period of peak creativity is itself a creative and cultural act, and its meaning is not yet settled. The defenders of the long tail argue that the show's continued existence is net positive, that even the episodes that do not reach the standard of the Golden Age are contributions to a body of work that includes the Golden Age, that the ongoing production keeps the characters and the world of Springfield alive in the cultural conversation in a way that ending the show would not, that there is value in the continued presence of this family on television, even when the individual episodes do not individually justify the presence. The critics of the long tail argue the opposite, that continued production of work that does not reach the standard of the show's best risks diluting the legacy, risks changing the cultural memory of what the show was, by creating more recent examples of what the show currently is, risks making it harder for new audiences to access the best work by surrounding it with a much larger volume of less good work. The critics are not wrong that this happens. The defenders are not wrong that there is value in the continued presence. Both arguments are real, and neither is fully satisfying, and the show keeps going regardless, as it has always kept going regardless. Because the show does not make decisions about its own continuation based on critical consensus. What is settled, and what is worth dwelling on in the last passages of a long consideration of the show, and what it has done and what it means, is the specific nature of the contribution that the best of the show made to the form of television comedy and to the culture more broadly. The contribution to the form. The Simpsons demonstrated that animated comedy for adult audiences was capable of doing everything that the best live-action drama and the best live-action comedy could do, and doing some of it better. Before The Simpsons, adult animation was either niche or edgy, or both. It existed in a separate space from mainstream television culture, was not taken seriously as a form, was not expected to produce work that deserved the kind of critical attention that prestige drama received. After The Simpsons, the category of adult animation was real and legitimate, and populated by an enormous variety of shows that might not exist without the precedent the show established. The form of the modern animated comedy for adults, its ambitions, its tonal range, its willingness to be serious and funny in the same breath, its formal adventurousness is traceable in large part to what The Simpsons demonstrated was possible. The contribution to the culture. The show created a shared reference language for American cultural life that was unlike anything that had previously existed in the same way. The specific lines and moments and characters that have been absorbed into everyday American communication, not as quotes from a show, but as part of the vocabulary through which people express certain things, certain feelings, certain recognitions about the world, constitute a cultural contribution that is genuinely hard to measure, but genuinely real. When someone uses a reference from The Simpsons to communicate something that the reference communicates more efficiently than any available alternative, they are using the show the way a culture uses its shared mythology. The show became mythology for a specific generation, and mythology in this sense is not an exaggeration. It is a description of what it means when stories become the medium through which a community understands itself. The contribution to the specific human beings who watched it. This is the hardest thing to account for, the most diffuse and the most real. The people who grew up watching The Simpsons, who watched it at the ages, when shows can shape how you see the world and what you expect from it and what you think is worth caring about. Those people carry something from the show that is not measurable and not reducible to any specific episode or moment or joke. They carry a relationship to comedy, to honesty, to the possibility of being genuinely funny and genuinely serious at the same time. They carry a specific expectation of what it feels like when something is really good. They carry the show in the way that the things you love when you are young become part of the equipment you use to live your life. That contribution is permanent. Whatever the show does from here, however many more seasons it produces, however the legacy of the long tail eventually resolves the contribution to the people who carry it is already complete. It happened. It cannot unhappen. The show went too far, in every direction, for 36 years, and in going too far, it reached people in ways that staying within conventional limits would never have allowed it to reach them. And those people are different for having been reached, and the world they live in and make is different for those people being different. That is the legacy, not the awards or the records or the cultural references or the merchandise or the theme park attractions, though all of those things are real. The legacy is the people. The people who sat on couches with their families and watched the family on the screen, who laughed at things they did not fully understand and understood things they did not know they understood, who were given by a cartoon family on a Sunday night something to hold on to that turned out to be worth holding on to. That is what the show did. That is what going too far was for. Section 17. Springfield After Dark. There is a version of Springfield that the show has never fully depicted. That exists in the gaps between what the episodes show and what the episodes imply. A version that is visible only if you watch with the particular kind of attention that looks at what is not there as much as at what is. The version of Springfield that is not shown is the Springfield that exists after the episode ends, after the reset has occurred, in the hours between the events that the camera follows and the events that the camera follows next. What does Springfield look like at 3 in the morning? What is happening on the streets outside Moe's when the bar closes? What conversations happen in the houses on Evergreen Terrace that no episode has ever been about? The conversations between neighbors who have known each other for 36 years and who carry 36 years of shared history in the specific way they address each other? In the things they do not need to say because they were both there? The show has occasionally glimpsed this Springfield. There are episodes that take place primarily at night. that follow characters through the hours when the town's official life has ended and its unofficial life continues. These episodes have a different texture from the daytime Springfield, quieter, more exposed, more willing to let silence accumulate before filling it, more interested in the spaces between words than in the words themselves. The Springfield of these episodes is a place where the comedy relaxes its grip slightly, where the characters can exist for a moment without being required to produce a joke or advance a plot, where the town can simply be itself for the length of a scene. The Burns Mansion at night is one of the most evocative of these spaces. The show has depicted Burns alone in the mansion many times, in rooms that dwarf him, surrounded by possessions that accumulate across a century without adding up to anything that looks like comfort. Burns has everything and is alone with everything. The mansion is large enough to contain a life. The life in it is not as large as the mansion. This is the show's most consistent visual argument about wealth. Not the economic argument, not the political argument about inequality or exploitation, but the personal argument that the accumulation of possessions and power does not resolve the fundamental loneliness of being a person, that the mansion is bigger than anyone needs, and the person inside it is smaller than the mansion, and that the relationship between the size of the space and the smallness of the person inside it is one of the things that money cannot correct. The Simpson house at night, by contrast, is exactly the right size. The rooms are full of the accumulated evidence of the family's existence, the mismatched furniture, the crayon drawings that have been on the refrigerator for so long that they have become part of the refrigerator, the small disasters and small repairs that constitute the material history of a home that is lived in. The house is full the way a full life is full, not with objects specifically chosen to demonstrate wealth or taste, but with objects that arrived because they were needed or loved or kept out of inertia, each one carrying a small weight of context that makes it mean something specific to the people who live with it. Homer asleep on the couch is one of the show's most recurring images. He is asleep in the middle of the day, asleep in the middle of a sentence, asleep in positions that no conscious person would choose. The sleep is comedy. Homer asleep is always comedy. The comedy of helplessness and unconsciousness and the human body's indifference to its dignity. But the sleep is also something else. It is the image of a person who works as hard as Homer works, physically and cognitively and emotionally, arriving finally at the moment when the work is done and the body can let go. The sleep is the reward. The couch is the reward. The house, noisy and imperfect and too small and always in need of something, is the reward. That is what Springfield After Dark contains. The specific human scale of things. The mansion that is too big and the house that is just right. The man who has everything and the man who has enough. The darkness that comes after the day and that holds, in its specific texture, the residue of what the day produced, the laughter and the argument and the reconciliation and the next morning's beginning, that the reset always promises and that the family always arrives at, together, on the couch, in the house, on the street, in the town. Springfield After Dark is the show at rest. And the show at rest is the show at its most honest. The family, the house, the night, and the quiet that holds everything together until the next episode begins. Section 18. What we gave them and what they gave us. The relationship between The Simpsons and its audience is not the relationship between a show and its viewers. It is closer to the relationship between a place and the people who grew up there, a relationship that involves not just the place as it currently exists, but the place as it existed at the specific moment when the person's relationship to it was formed, the version that lives in memory alongside and sometimes instead of the current reality. People who watch The Simpsons in its first decade carry a version of the show that is partially a television show and partially a memory of watching a television show, which are related but not identical. The television show is the episodes as they exist on the screen. The memory of watching is the episodes as they exist in the context of specific evenings, specific rooms, specific other people, specific ages at which you were capable of receiving different things and incapable of receiving others. The television show is fixed. The memory is not fixed. The memory evolves as the person evolves, as later experiences provide new context for older ones, as the things you could not understand at 10 become accessible at 20, and the things that were funny at 20 become poignant at 40. This is why conversations between people who love the show tend to have a quality of mutual recognition that goes beyond shared taste in television. They are recognizing each other as people who carry the same memory, not the same memory in the sense that the memories are identical, because they are not, because the specific evenings and rooms and ages were different for each person. But the same memory in the sense that what the memory is made of, the raw material of it is the same. The same yellow family, the same yellow town, the same episodes, the same jokes that landed for all of them, even though each of them was somewhere different when the landing happened. The show gave its audience this: a shared mythology that is also a shared memory, that is also, for many people, inseparable from memories of specific people and places that have nothing to do with the show itself. The people you watched it with, the houses you watched it in, the ages you were. The show became the setting for everything else that was happening, and everything else that was happening left its mark on the show, and now the show and the rest of life are woven together in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. This is what long-running shows do that nothing else does. They provide a continuous thread through time, a reference point that accumulates meaning as your life accumulates experience, a fixed thing against which the changes in yourself can be measured. Bart has been 10 for 36 years. That means you have changed around him in ways that are visible precisely because he has not changed. His not changing is the point. His not changing is how you know how much you have changed. And what did the audience give the show? Attention. First, the sustained, consistent, generation after generation attention that made the show's records possible, that kept it on the air, that translated into the commercial infrastructure that allowed the creative work to continue. Without the audience, nothing. But beyond attention, the audience gave the show meaning. Not just the meaning of being watched, which is the basic dignity that an audience confers on a work by receiving it. The audience gave the show the specific meaning that accumulates when a cultural object is used, when people quote it and reference it and build their relationships through it and use it to communicate things that they might not be able to communicate another way. The show became meaningful in the way that mythology becomes meaningful, which is through use, through the specific uses to which it is put by the people who live inside the culture that the mythology comes from. The audience used The Simpsons. They used it to laugh and to think and to communicate and to remember and to mourn and to celebrate and to understand their own families better by seeing the Simpson family from the outside and to understand themselves better by seeing their reactions to the Simpson family from whatever internal vantage point you watch from when you are watching something true. The exchange, what the show gave and what the audience gave, is not a commercial exchange, though it exists inside a commercial infrastructure. It is the older kind of exchange, the one that happens when a story is told and received, when the telling and the receiving together produce something that neither the teller nor the receiver could have produced alone. The show told the story, the audience received it, and what was produced in that exchange, the meaning, the memory, the mythology, the 36 years of Sunday nights, belongs to both of them equally and to neither of them completely. That is the final thing to say about The Simpsons and what it is and what it has been, and what going too far in every direction for 36 years was actually for. It was for this: the exchange, the story and the receiving of it. The Yellow family and the world that watched them, and the long, strange, beautiful, accumulated history of a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, that has been going too far since 1989 and has never quite stopped, and that will probably be going too far for as long as there are Sunday nights and couches and families to sit on them. Good night. You made it to the end. That's Springfield. That's the show. That has always been the show. Section 19. The show that refused to know when to stop. There is a particular kind of courage in refusing to end something that the world has decided should end. Not the courage of stubbornness, which is easy and comes naturally, and requires nothing more than the refusal to listen. The harder courage, the one that requires real thought and real conviction, is the courage of believing that the thing still has something to give, still has something in it that has not been given yet, and choosing on the basis of that belief to continue even when the consensus of the culture says that continuation is a mistake. The Simpsons has been continuing past the point where the culture decided it should have stopped for longer than most shows exist at all. The arguments for stopping began in the early 2000s and have not stopped since, have, if anything, intensified as each new season adds more distance between the show's current form and the form in which it was brilliant. The arguments are well-reasoned and honestly held. The people making them care about the show have cared about it for decades and are making the argument from a position of genuine love rather than dismissal. They want the show's legacy to be what it deserves to be, and they believe that continued production risks the legacy by adding more to the archive than the archive can absorb without changing its character. These arguments are not wrong. They are simply not the only arguments. The argument on the other side, the argument the show has been making by continuing to exist, is not easily stated because it is not primarily a verbal argument. It is an argument made by the act of continuation itself, by the fact of new episodes arriving, by the specific reality of the family still being there, and the writers still finding things to do with them, and the audience still, in sufficient numbers, tuning in to see what the things are. The argument is, we are still here, the family is still here, the town is still here, and being here is not nothing. Being here is the precondition for anything else, and the anything else is still occasionally worth the being here. A show that ran for 8 perfect seasons and then ended would be a different kind of object in the culture than The Simpsons is. It would be an achievement, a complete, closed, perfect achievement, the kind of thing you can point to as an example of what television can do at its absolute best. It would also be an artifact rather than a living thing. Its relationship to the culture would be the relationship of a finished object, fixed, stable, complete, available for study and reference and quotation, but not capable of responding to anything new, not capable of producing anything that the culture had not already received from it. The Simpsons, by refusing to stop, remains a living thing. Imperfect, inconsistent, no longer at the peak of what it was, but present and responsive and capable of being surprised by the world it is still trying to describe. It can still get things wrong in new ways. It can still occasionally get things spectacularly right. It can still produce an episode that makes you feel, for 22 minutes, that the show is still what it was, that the capacity for that quality of work is still present, still accessible, still a real thing and not just a memory of a real thing. That capacity is worth something. The fact that it is not consistently deployed does not cancel its existence. The fact that the gold standard of the early years is not reliably met does not mean the gold is gone. It means the mine is harder to work now than it was, which is true of mines and of artists, and of anything else that has been going for long enough that the easy surface wealth has been extracted, and what remains requires more effort and more skill and more luck to find. The show has been working harder to find what it finds for a long time. The work shows. The episodes of the later seasons carry the evidence of the effort in ways that the effortless-seeming brilliance of the early seasons did not. You can feel the seams in the later work in a way that you could not feel the seams in Homer, The Heretic, or Marge versus the Monorail or Last Exit to Springfield. The seams are real. They are not the show's failure to achieve something. They are evidence of the difficulty of achieving it. And the difficulty is itself information about how extraordinary the early achievement was, how rare the conditions that produced it were, how unlikely it is that any show will reproduce them, how remarkable it is that they existed in The Simpsons for as long as they did. The show that refused to know when to stop is the same show that knew, for a decade, exactly how far to go and how to go there, and how to bring the audience with it, and how to leave the audience at the destination with something they had not expected to find. The refusal to stop and the perfect knowing are the same show. You do not get one without the risk of the other. You do not get Bart sells his soul without accepting that the show might also one day produce an episode that does not come close to Bart sells his soul. The capacity for greatness and the risk of eventual diminishment are inseparable in long-running creative work. They come together. They leave together. The Simpsons accepted this. It accepted the risk of going on, the vulnerability of continuing past the point of peak performance, the specific exposure of allowing the comparison between what you were at your best and what you currently are to be visible in real time, in public, with the archive of your peak available for anyone to consult. That acceptance is its own kind of courage. The courage of the artist who knows they cannot always produce their best work, but who believes the work is still worth producing, who shows up season after season, episode after episode, to do the thing that they do with as much of what they have as they can bring to it on any given day. That is, in the end, the story of The Simpsons. Not the story of peak genius, though the peak genius was real and was extraordinary. The story of showing up. The story of going too far, season after season, and then coming back, and then going too far again. The story of the family, on the couch, in the house, in the town, at the end of the day, still there, still together, still watching the television in the living room, while the world changes outside the window and the sky above Springfield stays whatever color it needs to be for the story being told inside it. Still here. After everything, still here. That is the story. That is Springfield. That is, for better and for worse, and for everything in between, The Simpsons. Section 20. A final inventory of Springfield. Let us do one last thing before we leave. Let us take stock of what Springfield actually contains, not as a catalog of episodes or a list of characters, but as an honest account of what the town is made of, what it holds, what it has been trying to say across every episode and every season and every going too far. Springfield contains a nuclear power plant that has been poisoning the town for decades, and that the town cannot afford to hold accountable because the town's survival depends on it. This is not a cartoon dystopia. This is a description of a real dynamic that exists in real communities, where the largest employer is also the largest source of harm, and where the harm is tolerated because the alternative holding the employer accountable, closing the facility, accepting the economic consequences is worse than the harm, or seems worse, or has been made to seem worse by the people whose interests are served by the continuation of the harm. Springfield contains a family that should not work as well as it does. A father who is barely competent and barely conscious. A mother who contains more love and more frustration and more quiet determination than any one person should have to contain. A son who channels his enormous energy and intelligence into transgression, because transgression is the only form available to him, the only way he has found to matter in a world that mostly does not notice him. A daughter who is too much of everything for the world she lives in, too smart, too principled, too certain of what is right, and too aware of how rarely what is right is what happens. A baby who is watching all of this with eyes that miss nothing and a silence that says more than words. This family should be a tragedy. The conditions of their life, the economic precarity, the cognitive damage, the social isolation, the institutional indifference, the billionaire who owns the means of their survival and who has never known their names, these are the conditions of tragedy. And they are sometimes tragic. The show allows them to be tragic. It does not always rush the resolution or reach for the joke to fill the space where sorrow has arrived. But mostly they are not a tragedy. Mostly they are something else, something that does not have a clean name but that is real, and that the show has been depicting, with remarkable consistency, for 36 years. They are a family that keeps going. Not triumphantly, not with the triumphalism of a story that believes in happy endings and earns them through the proper disposition of narrative. They keep going the way real families keep going, imperfectly, through the accumulated weight of ordinary days, through the specific texture of mornings and dinners and Sunday nights in the couch, through the love that is not announced but is present, consistently present, in the way Homer looks at Marge when he thinks nobody is watching, in the way Marge holds the family together with a grip that looks like patience, but is actually something fiercer and more necessary than patience, in the way Bart and Lisa bicker and compete and protect each other in the same breath, in the way Maggie watches all of it and holds it in her eyes and keeps it. This family is Springfield. Not the power plant, not Burns, not the political satire or the celebrity appearances, or the treehouse of horror, or any of the other things the show contains. The family is why the show exists, and why it has always existed, and why it will keep existing for as long as the people making it believe, on some level, that the family has more to show us. And Springfield is America, not as a critique, not as a satire, not as an exaggeration designed to reveal what America looks like from a distance. Springfield is America in the way that a mirror is you. It is not the same as you. It is a representation, a reflection, an image that is reversed and flat and contained in a frame. But the resemblance is real, and looking at it tells you things about yourself that you cannot see by looking directly, things that are only visible when they are reflected. America is Springfield. America is the power plant, and the family living downwind of it. America is the billionaire who owns the town and the family who works for him, and the grandfather who made a deal with him, and the mother who fought him and lost, and the father who does not know why his life feels the way it feels. America is Ned Flanders doing everything right and getting nothing for it. America is the town that votes to forget. America is Lisa asking the questions that nobody wants to answer and continuing to ask them regardless. America is on the couch. America is watching the television in the living room of the house on Evergreen Terrace in the town that does not appear on any map because it is on all of them, because it is here, because it has always been here, because we built it the first time we sat down and laughed at a yellow family going too far and then coming home. We built Springfield. We have been living in it ever since. Thank you for staying till the end. If this kept you company tonight, if Springfield felt, for a little while, like somewhere worth being, then it did what it was supposed to do. Subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. The world is full of people watching Springfield in the dark, and it is good to know you are one of them. Good night. And if you are still reading, still listening, still somewhere in the middle of the night with Springfield playing in the background, then you already know what the show knows, that some things are worth staying with, worth returning to, worth letting wash over you in the dark until the light comes back. The Simpsons has been going too far for 36 years. It has been going too far and coming home. Going too far and coming home. And every time it comes home, the house is still there, the family is still there, the couch is still warm. That is the whole story. That has always been the whole story. Whatever you needed from tonight, rest, company, something to fill the silence, something to think about, something to simply let exist in the room with you, we hope Springfield gave it to you. It has been giving things to people for 36 years. One Sunday night at a time, one episode at a time, one going too far at a time. Until next time, stay on the couch. Let the town keep running. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is.